Alright, Chapter 7. Harvest of Deception. The Famine genocide campaign, launched by the Nazis in 1933 and revived on a massive scale 50 years later, reached a climax of sorts with the appearance in 1986 of the scholarly attack of Robert Conquest's Harvest of Sorrow and the visual assault of the film Harvest of Despair. Produced by the Ukrainian Famine Research Committee of the St. Vladimir Institute and made under the auspices of the Ukrainian Canadian Committee and the World Congress of Free Ukrainians, Harvest of Despair employs virtually all outdated and undocumented stills commonly used in the famine genocide campaign in its appeal to the emotion of the viewer. This nationalist propaganda film has been shown across Canada since 1984, used as yet another weapon in attempts to insert the famine genocide in school curriculum as part of a much wider campaign. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, apparently unaware of its complicity in this fraud, televised Harvest of Despair to a countrywide audience in the fall of 1985. Illustrating the Reagan-era tendency of the political and media establishments to accept anything anti-Soviet, the film won a gold medal and the Grand Trophy Award Bowl at the 28th International Film and TV Festivals in New York in 1985. Contradicting the prestige that such an honor implies, however, one New York magazine describes this film festival as notoriously known as a pay through the nose for a snatch of the big time festival. It has been denigrated over the years in this column for its policy of giving out specious official plaques to all entries regardless of quality. Participation trophies, dude. Perhaps smelling a rat, certain U.S. media outlets have been at least instinctively wary of this film. The public broadcasting system initially declined to handle it, while WNET wisely declared it inadequately documented, later qualifying their position by stating that it lacked journalistic integrity. In November 1985, WPBT in Miami rejected Harvest of Despair on the grounds that it had perceived bias in terms of the viewing public. Certain other U.S. media organizations have correctly described it as subjective and expressing one point of view. Notwithstanding such rejections, Harvest of Despair was reportedly in the lineup for the Academy Award, the equivalent of accepting the Cardiff Man into the Anthropologic Hall of Fame. In Harvest of Despair, a whole army of right-wing witnesses is paraded across the screen. In a post-war celluloid reunion of former allies from Hitler's ill-fated New Order in Eastern Europe, former Ukrainian Nazi collaborators, and ranking German Nazis make an appearance. These include Stepan Skripnik, whom the American historian Alexander Dalin points out was formerly the editor of the Nazi-controlled paper Volin under the German occupation. With the blessing of the Nazi occupiers in Ukraine, Skripnik graduated from layman to ordination as a bishop in a record time of 3 weeks. According to the Ukrainian nationalist wartime paper Nastup, Skripnik, as newly ordained bishop Mstislav, added his name to a joint telegram to Adolf Hitler, which stated, "In this hour, we appeal to the Almighty with ardent prayers and ask that He give you strength and health to complete the great cause you have begun. We believe that the time is not far off when, in a rejuvenated Europe built upon the basis of genuine Christian morals, the bells will ring joyously telling the world about your victory." According to the brochure accompanying Harvest of Despair, Skripnik's Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the United States was a financial contributor to the film's production costs. Harvest of Despair also features accounts by 2 former Weimar Republic diplomats to the Soviet Union, who switched over to the Nazis when Hitler seized power in Germany in 1933. The first is Hans von Herwarth, known during the war as Johann Herwarth von Bittenfeld. Herwarth returned to the Soviet Union with the Nazi invasion, whereas previous Russian experience was used to recruit mercenaries for Hitler's war machine from among Soviet prisoners of war. Herwarth. Okay, thank you. The second is Andor Henke, who served Hitler as a Nazi diplomat. In 1941, Henke approached the Belarusian nationalist emigre leader Vasil Zakharov to solicit support for Hitler's war aims and occupation of Belarusia. Belarus. Oh, it's just Belarus. In the film, Herr Henke appears to be either senile or otherwise incapacitated and does not actually present the famine genocide allegations attributed to him. Instead, his relatives do the talking for him. Supplementing the testimony of these former Nazis is Nazi war footage from the propaganda department of the Third Reich. The Nazi quote-unquote discovery of mass graves at Vinnytsia is presented, purporting to depict Soviet atrocities of the 1930s. In fact, Vinnytsia has been the scene for mass execution of Jews by the Nazis and local Ukrainian police in 1941. It would thus seem that the Harvest of Despair is utilizing Nazi propaganda of the Ukrainian fascists' own anti-Semitic atrocities to build their scenario of quote-unquote Russian genocide against Ukrainians. Malcolm Muggeridge, Tory England's favorite conservative anomaly, makes a predictable appearance in Harvest of Despair. A former British intelligence agent, Muggeridge has lent his name to various right-wing causes, writing, for example, the foreword to Aliskiv's famine book, Agony of a Nation. As noted previously, Nazi propagandists published anti-Soviet material by Muggeridge in the 1930s. Like Thomas Walker, Muggeridge claims to have made a breakaway private tour of Ukraine during the famine, and his accounts are cited as authoritative in right-wing circles. Revealingly, portions of the British newspaper which carried his famine allegations are reproduced in the film. One observes that Muggeridge was described therein as having entered Russia as a fervent communist, a revelation which must have come as a surprise to the British Communist Party. The journalistic gimmick of press-ordained communists, quote-unquote, becoming repentant to pro-capitalists within the space of a famine article was also used by the Hearst press. General Grigorenko, Ronald Reagan's favorite Russian defector, adds his presence to the film as well. This fellow is trotted about the US and abroad, expenses paid, to lecture folks on the evils of communism under the guise of human rights. Though you won't find him on US Indian reservations, unemployed demonstrations, or picketing the South African embassy. The ever-present Dr. James Mace of Harvard's Institute of Ukrainian Studies also puts in an appearance. As one of the top U.S. apologists for the post-Hitler crowd of Ukrainian nationalists in exile, Mace will on occasion jet across the continent to beat the drums as an expert on the famine genocide. In obvious appreciation for his work around the Cold War propaganda issue, Mace was appointed staff director of the U.S. government's Commission on the Ukrainian Famine in February 1986. Yet another player in this film is Soviet defector Lev Kopylev. However, previous writings by Kopylev had not indicated that he subscribed to the Russian versus Ukrainian famine genocide thesis. Famine researcher Marko Karyunik taped interview with Lev Kopylev was viewed in the spring of 1983 at Toronto's St. Vladimir Institute. In the original tape, Kopylov, in responding to the question of the famine being deliberately planned, denied that it was, although he speaks of instances of over-exuberant grain requisitioning by lower officials. Not surprisingly, this portion of the interview is censored from Harvest of Despair. Perhaps this incident is related to the fact that Karanik is suing the film's producer in the Supreme Court of Ontario for infringement of his copyright on the photographic material he provided for the film. Overall, the film's producer, Slavko Novytsky and Giri Luhovi, have managed to slap together a patchwork of material. Film reviewer Leonard Kaladi has noted that co-producer Luhovi admits most of his income comes from editing feature films of dubious quality. He has a reputation as a good doctor, someone who's brought in to salvage a movie which is deemed unreleasable by film exhibitors and distributors. In Harvest of Despair, it appears that the doctor delivered one of the great cinema miscarriages of all time. Objectivity and scientific presentation are sacrificed on the altar of Cold War psychological warfare. According to the Winnipeg Free Press, Luhovi personally viewed more than 1 million feet of historic stock footage to find roughly 20 minutes, 720 feet, of appropriate material for the film. This says less about his research than the total lack of photographic evidence of famine genocide. Indeed, not one documented piece of evidence is presented in the film to back up the genocide thesis. Instead, a montage of undocumented stills, the viewer is subjected to Thomas Walker Ditloff forgeries, numerous scenes stolen from the by now familiar publications covering the 1921 to 22 Russian famine, La Famine in Russie, and Information Number 22, Amende photos, with all their contradictions noted earlier, 1920s photos used in the Nazi organ Volkischer Beobachter in 1933. Certain Harvest of Despair photos can also be traced to Laubenheimer's Nazi propaganda books, as well as to a Ukrainian language publication published in Berlin in 1922. Hungary and Ukraine by Ivan Gerasimovich. Other scenes both borrow from the past and from the future. For example, footage of marching soldiers has Red Army men wearing uniforms from the days of the Russian Civil War. Footage of impoverished women cooking is also of the Civil War vintage. Other scenes display peasant costumes from the Volga Russia era of the immediate post-World War World War I period, not Ukrainians, in 1933. Footage of miners pulling coal sledges on their hands and knees is actually Tsarist-era origins. Scenes of peasants at meetings wearing peculiar tall-peaked caps date from earlier periods. Further, their clothing is not consistent with Ukrainian costume. Material filched from Soviet films of the 1920s can be identified, including sequences from Tsar Hunger and Arsenal, and even from pre-revolutionary newsreels. Tsar Hunger? Hunger? Who is Tsar Hunger? Oh, it is Hunger. Oh, it's literally just Hunger. Okay. Flipping forward to the future, the film shows scenes of military manufacturing of tank models, not produced until later in the 1930s. As well, the episode of the bread distribution in Nazi-besieged Leningrad, taken from the Siege on Leningrad 1 film of the epic Unknown War, was used by the authors of the video fraud as filmed evidence of food shortage in Ukraine of the 1930s. And so on and so on. So on and so on. It seems that, like others before them, the producers of Harvest of Despair scrunched through the archives, looking for bits and pieces of old war and starvation shots that might be spliced into the film to great subliminal effect, bound together with a narrative and interspersed partisan partisan interviews. As much has been admitted, as we will see. In November 1986, Ukrainian nationalists, in alliance with right-wing school board officials, made an attempt to place their famine genocide propaganda in the Toronto high school curriculum. Towards this end, a film showing The Harvest of Despair was arranged at the Education Center. Panelists advertised for the event, including the vice chairman of the Toronto Board of Education, Nola Crew, Dr. Yuri Boshnik, research fellow at Harvard Ukrainians Research Institute, and Marko Karinik, writer and researcher associated with The Harvest of Despair in its research stage. Confronted by this author in the discussion portion of the meeting, that the stills and footage used in the film were fraudulent, the panelists were forced to admit openly that this author's charges were true. They're reluctant to acknowledge the full extent of the fraud. Deliberate deceit was confirmed. As the Toronto Star reported, researcher Marko Karinik, who says he originated the idea of the film, says his concerns about questionable photographs were ignored. Karinik said that none of the archival film footage is of the Ukrainian famine, and that very few photos from the 32 to 33 appear that can be traced as authentic. A dramatic shot at the film's end of an emaciated girl, which has also been used in the film's promotional material, is not from the 1932 to 33 famine, Karinik said. I made the point that this was the sort of inaccuracy that cannot be allowed, he said in an interview. I was ignored. It's like, hey guys, did you know you're lying? Hey guy, did you know this is fake? I need you to know, like, this is fake. Did you know that you're lying? And they're like, yeah. Anyway, did you hear anyone? Did you hear anyone speaking? Did you hear anyone talking? I could have sworn I heard a bird or something. Perhaps this is why, to use the term of B.S. Onyshik, vice chairman of the Ukrainian Famine Research Committee, Kiernick was let go from the film before its completion. In light of the above, one wonders why Kiernick waited several years before coming forward publicly with the truth, and even then only after a public challenge and exposure by this author. In a quite incredible admission from an academic, Orest Subtelny, a history professor at York University, justified the use of frauds, noting that there exist very few pictures of the 1933 famine. Subtelny defended the actions of the film's producers. You have to have a visual impact. You have to show what people dying from a famine look like. Starving children are starving children. Needless to say, such frank admissions could not be allowed to unhinge a well-orchestrated international Cold War exercise. Within 2 days, the Ukrainian Famine Research Committee issued frantic denials fraught with contradictions, distortions, and untruths. The committee's press release claims, pictures from 1921 famine are used when the film deals with the 1921 famine. Pictures from the 1933 famine are used when the film deals with the 1933 famine. The Harvest of Despair section dealing with the 1921 famine is a 28-section fraction of the film, with which no one has taken issue. The original 1922 sources of specific stills used in relation to 1932 to 33 were identified in this author's release, distributed at the November meeting. Though confronted with the original sources of specific frauds, the committee seeks safety in largely falling back on secondary sources as a line of defense. The stills in the picture of 1932 to 33 famine, the committee states, are taken from 3 primary sources. Cited as the three sources are Mende's Human Life in Russia, the private collection of the wife of Nazi diplomat Andor Henke, the particular pictures are not identified, and the Walker fakes of the 1935 New York Evening Journal and the Chicago Herald and Examiner. Mende's pictures, they claim, are clearly traceable to the 1933 famine. This is claimed despite the fact that some of Mende's pictures appear in the 1922 book Holodmor Ukrainian, published by Ukrainian nationalists themselves and often cited by subsequent Ukrainian nationalist writers in relation to the 1921 famine. Furthermore, the committee alleges that Mende traveled extensively in Ukraine during the time of the famine. This is a rather novel claim. In fact, Mende witnessed only the 1921 Russian famine. Perhaps the committee should actually read Human Life in Russia. The committee states that Walker's photos were used only where they could be authenticated as coming from other sources. Does this mean matching them with photos in Human Life in Russia? But Mende claims a different year and photographer. Perhaps they were matched via their simultaneous appearance in various terse press newspapers. In that event, Walker equals Walker. If they were matched with the 1934 London Daily Express series by the anonymous tourist, they would have noticed that the accounts were Thomas Walker almost verbatim. It is possible that the authentication came from Lobenheimer's Nazi propaganda book, and you see the Soviets clearly. If so, they are not only crediting Nazi publications, but would have seen that Lobenheimer credits Ditloff's for the photos. This writer is still waiting to see how these so-called researchers have managed to authenticate the Chicago American Walker photographs as anything other than the pilfered pre-1930s frauds that they are. Concerning its use of stills in general, the committee gives the word of documentary to a new 1984 doublespeak meeting. All of the photographs used were only as visual aid illustrations. Where the origin of any still picture could not be verified by our committee or the producers of the film, they were either not used, or where they were used, it was only in places where they did not affect the narrative, and only as illustrations of the eyewitness accounts of others. Such use of these latter pictures are clearly recognized as proper by film producers of documentaries and do not in any way distort or affect the facts presented in the film or the authenticity of the events shown. Well, someone said they saw it, so it's basically the same thing as this other thing, which we did film. So, take that. What now? Such use, in fact, is not clearly recognized as proper. By definition, a documentary film visually documents, verifies facts, and events. Nowhere in the film are specific stills or footage identified as illustrative, as opposed to documentary. The very fact that non-authentic material was used is nowhere acknowledged in the film. Reminiscent of Nazi propaganda documentaries, quote unquote, of the 1930s, Harvest of Despair goes beyond dishonest scholarship. The pervasive use of misrepresented pictures misleads and manipulates the viewer to suit the political purposes of the film's creators. Given Koenig's admission that the film's producers ignored his protests, that this sort of inaccuracy cannot be allowed, one can only conclude that the Harvest of Despair represents deliberate fraud. It is not out of place to repeat this author's call for an independent review to further examine and evaluate this film, particularly given the grants and logistical support it received from publicly funded bodies such as the National Film Board of Canada and Multiculturalism Canada. Harvest of Despair is clearly not a documentary. Rather, it is a crude propaganda contribution to an ongoing Cold War campaign. Completely in keeping with this context, the film's co-producer, Luhovy, demonstrates his flair for late-night 1950s melodrama by declaring, "I cannot honestly say whether relatives of mine who live in the Soviet Union will suffer because of this film. Luhovy's Soviet relatives may well suffer severely from the embarrassment of having a kinsman produce such an odorous conglomeration serving such a long discredited cause." After much pomp and heraldry, including syndicated excerpts completed with fake photographs in the daily press, the long-awaited Ultimate Famine Genocide Study finally appeared in late 1986. Described as excellently and professionally written by none other than the West's leading feudalist fiction writer, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Harvest of Sorrow, Soviet Collectivization and the Terror Famine by Dr. Robert Conquest has emerged as the best attempt of the famine genocidists for legitimacy. Like the ubiquitous James Mace, Robert Conquest has been used for years to link the famine with the wider propaganda purposes of the right wing, considered by some to be Mace's mentor. Similarities of politics, methodology, and purpose are not surprising. Conquest's career as an obsessive anti-Soviet historian has spanned 2 Cold Wars. Presently, a senior research fellow at the Hoover Institution, he has long been associated with rightist emigres and anti-communist propaganda efforts as a quote-unquote expert. According to the London Guardian, Conquest was formerly employed by the British Soviet Services Disinformation Project, the Information Research Department, IRD. Key IRD targets were the Third World and the Russians. Embassies had resident IRD men undercover who planted materials with local journalists and opinion formers. Materials admitted by former senior officials to be heavily slanted. The Guardian further states, IRT also encouraged book production, described in Whitewall as cross-fertilization. Robert Conquest, frequently critical of the Soviet Union, was one of those who worked for the IRD. He was also in the FO, Foreign Office, until 1956. At IRD's suggestion, Conquest wrote a book about the Soviet Union. 1/3 of the books were brought up by Prager. Prager? Which reportedly had a hand in publishing the books at CIA request. I'm sorry, is this the same Prager? A 1986 publication provides further insight into the mentality and broader political purposes of famine genocide historians such as Dr. Conquest. What to Do When the Russians Come, a Survivalist Handbook by Conquest and John Manship White. White seems designed to push the U.S. political climate even further into the realm of Cold War paranoia and irrationality. Lauded by the Wall Street Journal and flogged by the ultra-right conservative book club, the handbook lowers U.S. Sovietology to the level of the film Red Dawn and the America TV series. Indeed, Conquest may have surpassed Hearst-level storytelling, approximating Nazi horror fiction on more issues than just the famine. A brief glance at the book's promotion proves illuminating. A full-page ad in Military History magazine trumpets, "Burn this book!" But that's only the beginning. If the peaceniks have their way, and Russia ever does take over, the alternative might be to spend the rest of your days up near the Arctic Circle. The above promotion draws up a list of ingenious variations of communist terror in store for democratic Americans, including the specter of gang rape of American women by Russian soldiers, a miserable fate for American children, and warnings of inevitable famine. But there may be hope. This book, its conservative book club promoters inform us, is where to learn about guerrilla warfare and about surviving. It cites the Wall Street Journal for an endorsement. Must reading about what to expect in the US if we become so spineless that the Soviets take us over. What better historian than to give a scholarly veneer to the famine genocide campaign than Dr. Robert Conquest? But some revisions were in order. Conquest's earlier work, The Great Terror, had alleged that only 5 to 6 million had perished in the 1932 to 33 period, only somewhat more than half being Ukrainians. This figure was inadequate for the new, improved 1980s famine genocide campaign. Amid renewed investigations of East European war criminals in North America, diversionary works with death calculations approximating or surpassing Hitler's 6 million Jewish victims were required. With the ascendancy of Reaganism and the growing Cold War mentality of U.S. criminology, conditions existed for the reintroduction of old far-right claims under the guise of serious scholarship. As published in a prominent Ukrainian nationalist journal, Conquest had, by 1983, upped his death estimates to 14 million and extended famine conditions to 1937. Such revisions coincided handily with the 50th anniversary of the famine genocide launched that year. Harvest of Sorrow's opening chapters and general outline of events tend to duplicate the traditional approach of American Sovietology to Soviet history and Leninist theory, as well as right-wing Ukrainian nationalist interpretations of Ukrainian history. Thus, the various nationalist cliques who held parts of Ukraine during the Russian Civil War and foreign intervention are simply presented as bona fide governments. Conquest's acceptance of the nationalist statehood mythology is unquestioning. The mass slaughter of Ukrainian Jews, carried out under the nationalists' independence, quote-unquote, in 1918 to 1919, is dismissed vaguely in 3 words. The Nazi occupation of Ukraine is presented implicitly as a break between periods of Soviet terror and the liberation from the Nazis as Soviet reoccupation. A critical examination of Conquest's references reveals a reliance on right-wing and spurious accounts to the point of being unbalanced. In addition to Thomas Walker's faked accounts, one finds the discredited black deeds of the Kremlin, Fred Beals of the Hearst Press infamy, Amende's Human Life in Russia, material published in Nazi Germany, and other dubious sources examined elsewhere in the book. A key chapter of Harvest of Sorrow, Chapter 12, The Famine Rages, can serve as an example of Conquest's subjective bias, reliance on unverifiable claims, and methodology of selection and evaluation. Chapter 12 contains 237 references. Over half, more than 120, are to rightist Ukrainian emigre sources, of which 50 alone refer to black deeds of the Kremlin. Veropay's Walker illustrated, partly anonymous Ninth Circle is cited 14 times. Other references include Communism, the Enemy of Mankind, published by the youth wing of the OUN Bandera, 1935 Hearst Press accounts, the CIA-funded Harvard Refugee Interview Project, and the McCarthy-era U.S. House Committee on Communist Aggression, 1955. Works of fiction are liberally used as bona fide documentation. For example, 13 references are to a novel allegedly by Vasily Grossman, published in New York. A revealing example of Conquest's scholarship, quote-unquote, can be seen in his selection of the following account for Chapter 12. A foreign correspondent reports that near Kiev, he witnessed the following scene. In one hut, they were cooking a mess that defied analysis. There were bones, pigweed, skin, and what looked like a boot top in the pot. The way the remaining half-dozen inhabitants of former populations of 40 eagerly watched this slimy mess showed their state of hunger. It turns out that the foreign correspondent is none other than Thomas Walker, the man who never was. Even more incredible, in his reference note for this quote, Conquest has backdated the issue of his Hearst press article from 1935 to February 26, 1933. In response to subsequent criticism leveled at his book, Conquest has attempted to defend the authenticity of the Thomas Walker materials. The facts speak for themselves, replies Mr. Conquest. While conceding that he did cite articles from the Walker series, he does not accept that they were fraudulent. This has never been established, he says. Conquest's photographic evidence consists of the same tired, outdated pictures. These include Thomas Walker's fakes, complete with the banner of Hearst, I always fuck up dates. I always just jump to the end for some reason. Hearst, March 6, 1935, Chicago American. One even finds the girl with the frog child, lifted from a 1922 Russian famine relief publication and made famous through the use by Walker, Amende, and Laumenheimer. In addition, one finds the old snow and ice summer of the 1933 graveyard scene that Amende tries to pass off in 1936, and an obvious 1921 to 22 relief shot of a posed line of starving children entitled The Homeless Ones. Again, in response to criticism, Conquest tries to justify the use of 1921 to 22 photos to illustrate allegations of famine genocide in 1932 to 33. Moreover, he says photographs from that time are difficult to identify clearly, and at any rate, he did cover the famine of 1921 in his book, so those from that period need not be inappropriate. Shades of Harvest of Despair. Aside from the political imbalance of Conquest sources, his reliance on memoirs reveals further defects in his research and methodology. One analyst of war memoirs states, the memoir is kind of a fiction, differing from the first novel, only by continuous implicit attestations of veracity. The further personal written materials move from the form of the daily diary the closer they approach the figurative and the fictional. One might add, particularly where self-serving issues of the political nature are concerned, and where unsavory aspects of the past must be concealed. American historian J. Arch Getty. Wait, is that the same Getty? Hold on. American historian J. Arch Getty has observed that for no other period or subject except for the study of Soviet Union in the 1930s, have historians been so eager to write and accept history by anecdote. He states, grand analytical generalizations have come from second-hand bits of overheard corridor gossip. Prison camp stories. My best friend met Bukharin's wife in a camp, and she said, have become primary sources on Soviet central political decision-making. The need to generalize from isolated and unverified particulars has transformed rumors into sources and has equated repetition of stories with confirmation. It is revealing It is a revealing characteristic of conquest's methodology pertaining to the Soviet Union, writes Getty, that he elevates rumor and hearsay to the level of historical fact. In fact, Conquest himself has stated, truth can only thus percolate in the form of hearsay, and on political matters, basically the best, though not infallible, source is rumor. Getty comments, such statements would be astonishing in any other field of history. Of course, historians do not accept hearsay or rumor as evidence. Having baptized hearsay and rumor into the realm of historical evidence in The Great Terror, the subject of Getty's criticism, Conquest proceeds to bestow upon them the rights of confirmation in Harvest of Sorrow. The following examples come from one page alone. A foreign communist was given figures of 10 million deaths for the USSR as a whole. The references to a 1935 Hearst Press article. Another foreign worker learned from local officials that Petrovsky had admitted a death toll so far of 5 million. The references to Fred Beale. It seemed reasonable to suppose that Duranty's figures derived from the same source as those, although never printed, given one of his colleagues by another high official, or at any rate, similar officials estimate circulating among authorities. Another American was told by a high Ukrainian official that 6 million had died, the references to Lang. A Ukrainian Canadian was told that a secret report gave a figure of 10 million dead. Conquest's calculation of death estimates, when not relying on traditional right-wing and faminology figures, adds little new to famine genocide demography. Like others before him, Conquest derives an on-paper shortage of millions upon millions of people by comparing census figures with projections based on earlier population growth rates. On this question, as with other aspects of the thesis of famine genocide, Harvest of Sorrow fails to break out of the discredited, politically motivated methods of famine genocide research. Conquest's unswerving anti-communist bias allows him to wallow in the morass. 10
Morass.
seconds. It is morass! Where was I? I'm just thinking about ass now. Morass. Conquest's unswerving anti-communist bias enables him to wallow in the morass of rightist materials, where critical scholars fear to tread. But then, serious objective scholars hardly lend their talents to such neurotic priorities as survivalism and commie takeovers of America. Conquest's use of long-established fraudulent accounts, such as Walker's hardly, lends credibility to the claims made in the dust jacket of Harvest of Sorrow, that the book has been meticulously researched. Thus, the definitive scholarly and visual evidence of genocide presented in Harvest of Sorrow and Harvest of Despair falls short. Harvest of Despair and Sorrow... Despair and Sorrow are more definitive of those attempting to reap a harvest of Cold War-style anti-Sovietism by falsely interpreting the famine of 1932 to 33 as quote-unquote planned genocide. Chapter 8, The Famine. Evidence, quote-unquote, prominently featured in the famine genocide campaign has been shown to be fraudulent or suspect. Fake photographs, unscientific statistics juggling, and politically motivated hearsay and testimony are among the many devices employed to embellish allegations of famine genocide. Subject to similar manipulation are the causes of famine, drought, sabotage, Soviet amateurish planning, excesses, and mistakes in history's first mass socialization of agriculture in the context of a hostile international environment. Okay, I do disagree with Tottle's analysis here. He's talked about the amateur planning of the Soviet Union and the mistakes, quote unquote mistakes. So I guess we get into that more here. I do think he's wrong. It seems wrong to me to blame the mistakes, alleged mistakes. Throughout the history of the famine genocide campaign, the factors of drought and sabotage have been ignored, denied, downplayed, or destroyed. Soviet excesses and mistakes, in contrast, are emphasized, given an anti-Ukrainian motivation, described as deliberately and consciously planned, and the results exaggerated in depictions of starvation deaths in multi-millions. The central event, the collectivization of agriculture, as part of the socialist development, is never given anything but a classically anti-communist interpretation. As in Ronald Reagan's black and white world of terrorists and freedom fighters, it is inconceivable and completely unacceptable to the Ukrainian nationalist and Sovietologist interpretation that socialism and the Soviet Union should be acknowledged as having any popular support and the right to exist. How neatly a Soviet genocide fits into their stereotyped image of Bolshevik tyranny. Quote unquote. For some promoters of famine genocide, anything other than man-made causes are ignored or denied. Natural causes, such as drought, are alleged to have never taken place. Claims that drought was a contributing factor are denounced as Soviet inventions. One might expect then that no non-Soviet source could be cited to substantiate drought. However, A History of Ukraine by Mikhail Hrushevsky describes the nationalists themselves as Ukraine's leading historian. States, again, a year of drought coincided with chaotic agricultural conditions. And during the winter of 1932 to 33, a great famine, like that of 1921 to 22, swept across Soviet Ukraine. Indeed, nowhere does History of Ukraine claim a deliberate man-made famine against Ukrainians, and more space is actually devoted to the famine of 1921 to 22. Posthumously published in 1941 by the major Ukrainian nationalist group in the United States at the time, the Ukrainian National Association, Hrushevsky's history was updated to 1940 based on notes by Dr. Luke Maishuha. Lest anyone accuse Maishuha of being a communist dupe, it should be noted that he is identified in the book's acknowledgments as editor-in-chief of the Ukrainian nationalist paper Svoboda. Svoboda's Rome correspondent dished out money supplied from the U.S. to the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which moved its headquarters to fascist Italy in late 1940. Mayusha himself visited Berlin in 1939, speaking over Nazi radio in Ukrainian, and his Nazi connections were the subject of testimony before the U.S. Congressional Dies Committee. Dies? Dies? Committee? Under the... Oh, it is Dies. Oh, it's named for... under the control of Chairman Martin Dies. More recent histories can also be cited on the subject of drought. Nicholas Riasnovsky, former visiting professor at Harvard University's Russian Research Center, notes in his History of Russia that drought occurred in both 1931 and 1932. Michael Florensky, immediately followed by a description of the mass destruction wrought by Kulak resistance to collectivization, states, severe droughts in 1930 and 1931, especially in the Ukraine, aggravated the plight of farming and created near-famine conditions. Professor Emeritus at Columbia and a prolific writer on the USSR, Florensky can hardly be accused of leftist sympathies. Born in Kiev, Ukraine, he fought against the Bolsheviks in the Civil War. Even Ewald Amende, the first major political famine writer of the 1930s, credits causes other than pre-planned communist genocide. Primarily blaming breakdowns and inefficiency of Soviet collectivization in agriculture, Amende states, if a future harvest were severely injured by climactic or other natural causes, as was the case in 1933, the catastrophe would once more reach vast dimensions. Not surprisingly, Contemporary famine genocide writers avoid reference to the above quote from Human Life in Russia. While drought was a contributing factor, the main cause of the famine was the struggle around the collectivization of agriculture, which was raged in the countryside during this period. 10 years after the revolution, private production still dominated the agricultural economy. Backwardness in manual labor characterized the state agriculture on the millions of small-scale peasant farms. In 1928, 3/4 of the land was sown by hand. 1/3 of the crop area was harvested by sickle and scythe. 40% of the crop was threshed by flail. Flail? What's that? Over 1/4 of peasant households possessed no draft animals, or farming implements, and 47% only had plows. An integral part of socialist development and the basis for mechanization and all-around modernization of agricultural production, collectivization, represented a revolution of rural life. Small individual peasant holdings were united into large cooperative collective farms. Developed first on a voluntary basis, collectivization accelerated in the late 1920s and became a concerted drive by the end of the decade. A key feature of the USSR's first five-year plan launched in 1929. Collectivization, socializing, and the agricultural economy included ending private ownership by the means of agricultural production. Socialization of the land was coupled with socialization of drought and productive draft. What is a draft animal? Draft? Okay. Socialization of the land was coupled with socialization of draft and productive animals, farm buildings, machinery, and equipment. Ending private ownership meant that the class of private owners, the kulaks, would no longer exist as a class. This policy was called eliminating the kulaks as a class, and was part of the full-scale collectivization program underway by the beginning of the late 1930s. Of the 1930s. Though only a small fraction of the farm population, the kulaks occupied a significant place in agricultural production, with a larger crop area and marketable grain production than their number implied. In 1927, for example, 4% of the households owned 15% of the area under crop. The kulaks were the moneylenders, the middlemen, the entrepreneurs of the countryside. It was primarily they who owned the farm sires, the rural industrial enterprises such as mills and smithies, who leased the poorer peasants their farm implements, machinery, and draft animals, who controlled a large percent of the retail trade in the rural areas. As part of the collectivization program, the land of the kulaks was to be confiscated and transferred to the collective farms, as was their cattle, machinery, and other farm property. A sizable number of their wealthier kulak families were to be evicted from collectivization areas. The kulaks responded, fighting against collectivization with an organized campaign of large-scale destruction. The struggle swept through the countryside, approaching civil war scale in many areas, with devastating results, particularly in Ukraine. Private ownership is not the same as personal ownership. Yes, private ownership concerns the means used to produce the goods. For example, machinery. Under private ownership, goods produced by the labor of others belong to those who own the means of production. For example, cars made by auto workers do not belong to them, but to the owners of the car factory. Frederick Schumann, Woodrow Wilson, professor of government at Williams College at the time of writing, states that he and thousands of other tourists traveled in Ukraine during the famine period. He writes, their kulak opposition took the initial form of slaughtering their cattle and horses in preference to having them collectivized. The result was a grievous blow to Soviet agriculture, for most of the cattle and horses were owned by the kulaks. Between 1928 and 1933, the number of horses in the USSR declined from almost 30 million to less than 15 million. Of horned cattle from 70 million, including 31 million cows, and to 38 million, including 20 million cows. Of sheep and goats from 170 million to 50 million, and of hogs from 20 million to 12 million. Soviet rural economy had not recovered from this staggering loss by 1941. Some kulaks murdered officials, set the torch to the property of the collectives, and even burned their own crops and seed grain. More refused to sow or reap, perhaps on the assumption that the authorities would make concessions and would, in any case, feed them. The aftermath was Ukraine's famine, quote-unquote, of 1932 to 33. Lurid accounts, mostly fictional, appeared in the Nazi press in Germany and in the Hearst press in the United States, often illustrated with photographs that turned out to have been taken along the Volga in 1921. The famine, quote-unquote, was not, in its later stages, a result of food shortage, despite the sharp reduction of seed grain and harvests flowing from special requisitions in the spring of 1932, which were apparently occasioned by fear of war with Japan. Most of the victims were kulaks who had refused to sow their fields or had destroyed their crops. Unlike many famine genocide theorists who discount kulak sabotage, some Ukrainian nationalists offer enthusiastic descriptions of sabotaging and terrorism. Isaac Mazepa, former premier of Petluria's nationalist government in Ukraine and a diehard nationalist till his death, admitted frankly that the crop failures and, logically, much of the resulting famine were largely due to these causes. At first, there were disturbances in the Kolkhozy collective farms, or else the communist officials and their agents were killed. But later, a system of passive resistance was favored, which aimed at the systematic frustration of the Bolsheviks' plans for the sowing and gathering of the harvest. The catastrophe of 1932 was the hardest blow that the Soviet Ukraine had to face since the famine of 1921 to 22. The autumn and spring sowing campaigns both failed. Whole tracts were left unsown. In addition, when crops was being gathered in many areas, especially in the south, 20, 40, and even 50% was left in the fields and was not collected at all, or was ruined in the threshing. One doubts that the nationalist heroes, those property groups who committed great destruction of agricultural resources, were charitably received by the rest of society, which suffered as a result. The destruction of the means of life must have been regarded as criminal. The struggle around collectivization was not limited to kulaks. A considerable number of middle peasantry were wrongly treated as kulaks. Instead of being won over to supporting collectivization, they resisted collectivization. Louis Fisher observed, "I myself saw all over the Ukraine in October 1932 huge stacks of grains which the peasants had refused to gather in and which were rotting. This, I write, was their winter's food. Then those same peasants starved. Mr. Chamberlain has falsely interpreted the famine, and some Americans have accepted this interpretation." Problems inherent to the massive introduction of a new collective system of farming further complicated the situation. The very scale and speed of collectivization was astounding. In the space of 4 years, over 14 million farms were collectivized, including 70% of the farms in Ukraine. Collectivization took place at rates and with methods subject to extreme swings depending on the abilities and attitudes of the local regional authorities. Careful planning gave way to confusion, as even at the top level, collectivization schedules and targets were subject to drastic changes and revisions. With limited historical experience to draw upon, and in a countryside renowned for backwardness and age-old peasant traditions, millions of small strips and holdings were amalgamated into a few 100,000 collective farms. Peasants, long used to manual labor and working with draft animals, were now introduced to tractor plows, tractor-drawn seeders, mechanical combines, and threshers. Again, this background in widespread sabotage, a smooth transition, uh, a smooth transition was impossible. Again, I just disagree. I think there's too much, like, understanding given to the kulaks here. And I disagree that, like, peasants were, treated as if they were kulaks. Added to this were errors and excesses committed in the course of collectivization. Contrary to what nationalist ideologues and experts would have us believe, Soviet historiography does not ignore this period, nor does it gloss over errors committed. It is true, though, that little has been written in the Soviet Union specifically about the famine, as contemporary Soviet life is demanding a more open look at their history. One can expect this will change. The 8-volume, 2 of which are double, History of the Ukrainian SSR, offers the following analysis and criticism in the chapter Struggling Against Distortions of the Party Line in the Building of Collectivization. On the path of establishing the collectivization movement were placed great difficulties, which, conditioned by the newness and complexity of the process, the age-old peasant tradition of private ownership, technical economic obsolescence, and the great shortage of the cadre. These difficulties were complicated by the capitalist encirclement in which the Soviet state found itself and the intensification of class struggle in the rural areas. In these conditions, the distortions of the party line towards the building of collectivization, which were noticed in the first stage of solid collectivization, were especially dangerous. The leadership of a number of regions, in pursuit of high percentages of collectivization, instead of persistent and painstaking organizational mass working among the peasantry, took instead the path of coercion. Many mistakes and distortions were made by responsible workers of Shepetchusky, Tolchian, Proskyrev, and various other regions during the last 20 days of February 1930. The level of collectivization in some districts jumped from 10 to 15 to 80 to 90%. Distortions in the movement for collectivization were also tied to the phenomenon that Republican and local organizations did not always issue correct instructions. Thus, in the Ukraine, regional and district party committees received on February 24, 1930, a directive to collectivize the steppes and by the end of the spring sowing campaign, and the entire Ukraine by the autumn of 1930. This was a vulgar violation of the directives of the party concerning the rates and methods of collectivization. A particularly dangerous distortion of the party policy in regard to the collectivization movement was the incorrect approach taken towards the middle peasantry in various districts. Accomplishing the course of collectivization, the party guided itself by the Leninist approach that successes in the socialist transformation of agriculture were dependent, to a large extent, on the attitude of the middle peasantry. Nevertheless, there were cases of dealing with the middle peasantry as if they were kulaks. As was noted in a letter to party organizations from the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolshevik, of April 2, 1930, the policy of strengthening the alliance with the middle peasantry with the support of the poor peasantry, and in conditions of merciless struggle against the kulaks, began to be replaced by the policy hostile to Leninism of commandism in relation with the middle peasantry. Commandism. All these distortions and mistakes, which had nothing in common with the Leninist line of the party, were useful to the kulaks, the bourgeois nationalists, and right opportunists and Trotskyists. Arbitrary methods, a system of administrative command, and treating middle peasants as kulaks expanded the opposition to collectivization and the social and economic upheaval. Soviet mistakes and excesses, drought, and the organized campaign of sabotage and resistance resulted in the famine of 1932 to 33. There was no plan to wipe out Ukrainians as a people. The mistakes, even when accompanied by tragic and unforgivable excesses, do not constitute pre-planned genocide. There's no genocidal intent. In fact, the intent was to feed people. The famine was compounded by typhus epidemics. Internationally acclaimed urban planner and recipient of the Order of Canada, Dr. Hans Blumenfeld, worked as an architect in the Ukrainian city of Makayevka at the time of the famine. He writes, "There was indeed a famine in 1933, not just in Ukraine, but also in the Lower Volga and the North Caucasus. And Makayevka, located near the junction of these three regions, felt the full impact of it. Only once did I see a child with spindly legs and a swollen belly. It was in the garden of a nursery school at the hand of a nurse waiting for the doctor. Nor did I ever see a corpse lying in the street. There is no doubt that the famine claimed many victims. I have no basis on which to estimate their number. Probably most deaths in 1933 were due to epidemics of typhus, typhoid fever, and dysentery. Waterborne diseases were frequent in Makayevka. I narrowly survived an attack with typhus fever. Very occasionally, sources from the famine genocide camp note that the widespread epidemics. Despite the absurdity of his death guesstimate, Horsley Gaunt confirms this point, as cited in the following Dalrymple passage. He, Gaunt, reports that the peak of the typhus epidemic coincided with that of the famine. He adds, however, that because starvation was complicated by the epidemics, it is not possible to separate which of the two causes was more important in causing casualties. The famine did not extend past the pre-harvest period of 1933. To further their political ends, the famine genocide campaigners of the 1930s, such as Amende and the Hearst Press, attempted to stretch out the famine into, and occasionally even beyond, 1934. Their followers of the 1980s rarely dare to make such similar claims. The success of the 1933 harvest was guaranteed by measures taken by the Soviet government to overcome the situation. 35 million poods of seed. Poods! An old Russian unit of weight, equal to about 36 pounds. 35 million poods of seed, foodstuffs, and fodder were sent to Ukraine in the spring of 1933. Changes were made to improve the organization and management of the collective farms, and thousands more tractors, combines, and trucks were delivered. Dr. Hans Blumenfeld offers a useful personal summary of the period. The famine was caused by a conjunction of a number of factors. First, the hot, dry summer of 1932, which I had experienced in northern Vyatka, had resulted in crop failure in these semi-arid regions of the south. Second, the struggle for collectivization had disrupted agriculture. Collectivization was not an orderly process following bureaucratic rules. It consisted of actions by poor peasants, encouraged by the party. The poor peasants were eager to expropriate the kulaks, but less eager to organize a cooperative economy. By 1930, the party had already sent out cadres to stem and correct excesses. After having exercised restraint in 1930, the party put on a drive again in 1932. As a result, in that year, the kulak economy ceased to produce, and the new collective economy did not yet produce fully. First claim on the inadequate product went to urban industry and to the armed forces. As the future of the entire nation, including the peasants, depended on them, it could hardly be otherwise. In 1933, rainfall was adequate. The party sent its best cadres to help organize in the kolkhozes. They succeeded. After the harvest of 1933, the situation improved radically with amazing speed. I had the feeling that we had been pulling a heavy cart uphill, uncertain if we would succeed. But in the fall of 1933, we had gone over the top, and from then on, we could move forward at an accelerating pace. The tasks of socializing industrial and agricultural production, however, much anathema to capitalists and others who oppose socialism, were aimed at raising conditions to the level of the 20th century. The Soviets felt that socialization and development were critically necessary to the survival of their country, particularly in light of the rise of fascism elsewhere in Europe and Japanese expansionism in the East. The American journalist Albert Rees Williams, probably, observed as much and quoted Stalin as saying in 1931, "We are from 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must run through this distance in 10 years. Either we do this or they will crush us." And run they did. The collectivization program and the large-scale industrialization projects of the 5-year plans of 1930s were directed at building a modern industrial country, further developing socialism, and strengthening the ability of the USSR to defend itself. At great cost, against tremendous difficulties, and not without painful mistakes and excesses, the Soviet Union achieved its goals. American journalist Howard K. Smith observed, "Production found in 1913 level... Oh, sorry. No. Production found its 1913 level only in 1928. Then they began their plans for industrialization. In other words, they had not 23, but only 12 years to prepare for World War II. The measure of their success is in the comparative indices of industrial production for 1940, with level of 1913 as index 100 in all cases." Oh my God. Okay, so France is at the 93 index, UK 113, USA 120. So they've recovered like 20 points between the wars is what they're talking about. Germany at 131, USSR 908, dude. God damn. As to the results of collectivization and industrialization in Ukraine during this period, American journalist Edgar Snow wrote in the Saturday Evening Post, "Ukraine in 1940 was second only to the United States in the mining of iron and dug twice as much as France and the leading European producer." France, the leading, yeah, sure. Its blast furnaces smelted more pig iron than England and twice as much as France, being exceeded only by the United States and Germany. In steel production, it stood fourth in the world, far ahead of such countries as France and Japan. Coal mining stood in the same position. In field husbandry, Ukraine is famous for more than its grain. Its potato crop is exceeded in the world only by Germany and Poland. It is the world's largest producer of beet sugar. Vegetable oil is pressed from an annual crop of more than 1 million tons of sunflower seeds. Cotton and natural fiber are large new crops. Significantly, the recognition of these accomplishments has been granted by some Ukrainian nationalist historians, as the above was cited in Ihor Kamensky's book, Hitler's Occupation of Ukraine, 1941 to 44. The achievements of socialist construction are all the more remarkable in light of the very real problems and difficulties of the 1930s. Almost in themselves, they give the lie to allegations of 7 to 15 mass starvation deaths, having occurred a mere 6 to 7 years previous, suggesting something quite different from the Holocaust line of Anitzer, Hearst, the Nazis, the Ukrainian nationalists, and modern-day Cold Warriors. The fact that Japan seized Manchuria and Hitler seized power in Germany during the very period of the famine may indicate that the Soviet Union undertook its crash programs barely in time. The social reorganization of Soviet industry and agriculture, so despised by right-wing emigres and capitalists alike, proved to be Europe's successful bulwark against Hitler's war machine. Despite initial enormous losses at the beginning of the war, within a year, the Soviets' real power was apparent to the Germans. As historian Heinz Honne states, 2 sobering years of bloody war in Russia provided cruel proof of the falsity of the tale about subhumans. As early as August 1942, in its report from the Reich, the SD noted that the feeling was growing among German people that we have been the victims of delusion. The main and startling impression is of the vast mass of Soviet weapons, their technical quality, and the gigantic Soviet effort of industrialization, all in sharp contrast to the previous picture of the Soviet Union. People are asking themselves how Bolshevism has managed to produce all of this. Had not Nazi Germany and its European allies broken their backs against the social and industrial might developed by the USSR in the 1930s, the Axis powers, armed with the additional wealth of Soviet resources, could well have emerged the victors. In that event, it is a moot question as to whether any Ukrainian nationalists would have survived the Nazis' planned race programs to write about famine genocide. According to Ukrainian nationalists, the famine affected, or rather was consciously directed, almost exclusively against ethnic Ukrainians. Indeed, the Black Deeds of the Kremlin openly states as much, and would have us believe that other nationalities were unaffected and eating normally. The scope of the hardships is chauvinistically restricted, distorted, and politically manipulated. Other nationalities who suffered, Russians, Turkmen, Kazakhs, Caucasus groups, are usually ignored, or, if mentioned at all, are done so almost reluctantly in passing. It is as though the nationalist xenophobic horror stories can tolerate no competitors. Bolshevik quote-unquote Russians are pitted against quote-unquote pure Ukrainians. The breathtaking verbal sorties, at times unsurpassed outside Nazi literary circles, we are told this whole monstrous horde of Russian communists, like a pack of beasts of prey, threw themselves in on it already impoverished and plundered Ukraine. We still hear the same kind of thing. People refer to like Russian orcs or whatever. James Mace also attempts to interpret the famine as deliberately focused against certain nationalities, going so far as to claim that famine stopped precisely at the border with Russia and Belarus, Belarus, proper. Right-wing historian Alec Nove, who otherwise supports the deliberate famine thesis, takes issue with Robert Conquest's emphasis on ethnicity as the determining factor. There is one matter on which one must disagree with conquest. It is what could be called the Ukrainian aspect. Russians who happened to be in the area affected, in Lower Volga and North Caucasus, for example, also died. Yes, the Ukrainian countryside suffered terribly, but conquest seems prone to accept the Ukrainian nationalist myth. Dr. Hans Blumenfeld, writing in response to Ukrainian nationalist allegations of Ukrainian genocide, draws on personal experience in describing the people who came to town in search of food. They came not only from the Ukraine, but in equal numbers from the Russian areas to our east. This disproves the fact, quote unquote, of anti-Ukrainian genocide parallel to Hitler's anti-Semitic Holocaust. To anyone familiar with the Soviet Union's desperate manpower shortage in those years, the notion that its leaders would have deliberately reduced that scarce resource is absurd. Up to the 1950s, the most frequently quoted figure was 2 million victims. Only after had it been established that Hitler's Holocaust had claimed 6 million Jewish victims did anti-Soviet propaganda feel it necessary to top that figure by substituting the fantastic figure of 7 to 10 million. Most contemporary non-Ukrainian nationalist famine genocide historians do not attempt to limit the famine to Ukraine. At the same time, however, they try to portray the period of the early 1930s collectivization as one of mass destruction of the Ukrainian people and of their ethno-cultural annihilation. Some even go so far as to extend famine conditions up to the end of the decade. What? If such claims were true, one might have expected the Nazis, along with their Ukrainian fascist marching groups and interpreters, to have discovered a thinly populated wasteland of backward and Russified starvelings when they invaded Ukraine in 1941. The Ukrainian nationalist collaborators from Western Ukraine, who entered Soviet Ukraine alongside the Nazi armies, give a rather different account. For example, prominent nationalist Lev Shankivsky in Pokhtini Khrupi OUN marching groups, quotes the report of a Galician cultural worker. One can come across an ordinary village girl. During our talk, we discover that the girl is well versed in mathematics, physics, chemistry, and has finished secondary school and worked as a tractor driver. In other examples, one could meet a former university, medical institute, or teacher's college student among the village girls. Such cases are frequent. People are well informed. One could discuss any political or social theme with the peasants. Our fellows, the Galician OUN fascists, fared badly in discussions on professional matters or knowledge of state structure. One can only wonder what kind of genocide results in such cultural and educational advances. Other sources describe an even more hostile reaction of the Ukrainian population to the Nazis' nationalist puppets. A priest, Father Oyenko, dispatched by the Nazis to Kiev, was sorely troubled, as indicated by a wartime letter to a friend. I have been here for already several months, but I can find no spiritual peace. You can imagine how Bolshevism has changed everything. People are malicious and consider us enemies in the way that perhaps their ancestors once treated the Tartars. Complete disrespect. Everywhere we find pointed hostility. All Ukrainians arriving from the outside, nationalist collaborators, they call fascist spies, Hitler's mercenaries, which I admit is partly true. The Germans really do assign us the dirtiest jobs. The record of Ukrainian resistance to the Nazis and their Ukrainian nationalist auxiliaries is exemplary. As American authority on the Soviet Union, William Mandel states, in the largest eastern portion of Ukraine, which had been Soviet for 20 years, loyalty was overwhelming and active. There were 500,000 organized Soviet guerrillas. Around 4,500,000 ethnic Ukrainians fought in the Soviet army. Clearly, that army would have been fundamentally weakened if there had been basic disaffectations among so large a component. The nationalists own Ukraine. Ukraine, a consensus encyclopedia, admits to an even greater number of Ukrainians having fought in the Red Army, giving an estimate of approximately 5 million. One can only be amazed at the ability of a nation to mobilize such numbers of predominantly military-age males in light of the nationalists' claimed famine death figures. The encyclopedia also concedes that out of 11,000 Hero of the Soviet Union medals awarded, 2,000 went to Ukrainian soldiers. Mendel, among others, explains the solid defense of the Soviet Union. There was an obvious reason for this loyalty. For the bulk of Ukrainian peasants, workers, and the professionals newly emerged from those classes, the Soviet system had demonstrated overwhelming economic and cultural advantage. In fact, the only area in which the nationalists found any kind of base during the Nazi occupation was informally, up until 1939, Polish Galicia, where the Nazis did the bulk of their recruiting for fascist police and SS units. This is confirmed by historian Roman Shvoporluk, who writes that the zones of operation of organized Ukrainian nationalism was limited to the former Polish territories, that is, to the political base area of pre-war Ukrainian Galician fascist movement. The truth of the matter is that from 1918 to the present, the various factions of Ukrainian nationalists have had little support to speak of from the Ukrainian people themselves. Nationalist Mykola Stepanenko begrudgingly admits that the current Ukrainian resistance and nationality defense movement has not yet enjoyed the support or active participation of technocrats, government officials, lower and middle echelon party members, professionals, and workers. One could only add that if the Ukrainian people didn't support the nationalists at the time of Stepanenko's writing in exile in 1977, they certainly didn't while he was goose-stepping around Europe in the Nazi uniform of the 14th Waffen SS Division. Had the 1941 population of Soviet Ukraine consisted of the remnants and survivors of a mass multi-million Holocaust of a few years previous, or if they had perceived the 1932 to 33 famine as a genocide, deliberately aimed at Ukrainians, then doubtless fascism would have met a far different reception. Soviet Ukrainians would have been as reluctant to defend USSR as Jewish survivors would have been to defend Nazi Germany. But as we shall see next, the Nazi occupation of Ukraine is relevant not just for the opposition to the Nazis from overwhelming majority of the population. It is also very relevant for the role played by the Ukrainian nationalists, the main perpetrators of the famine genocide myth. It started rough. I was not sure about where he was going with that. To be frank, to be totally honest, I wasn't sure if he would land that plane, and he did. It's all making sense now. I see what he did there. He got me in the first half. He did he did get me in the first half. Let's get into chapter 9. Collaboration and collusion. On June 30, 1941, the Nazi army entered Lviv, capital of western Ukraine. In its vanguard came the German uniformed Nachtigall battalion of Ukrainian nationalists, under the command of Roman Skukevich, with the collusion of Nazi Abwehr, the Bandera faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, immediately set up a so-called Government of Western Ukrainian Lands, headed by Yaroslav Stetsko, who had accompanied the Nazi invaders to the city. The pogroms of the Lviv area's Jewish population at once was launched. This was anticipated, noted Philip Weiss, a leader of Winnipeg's Holocaust Committee and survivor from Western Ukraine, by the air of fear and terror hanging over the city because the approaching German army and the public knowledge of the forthcoming pogrom of Jews by Ukrainian nationalists. American writer Saul Friedman, who undertook extensive research on the historical persecution of Jews by Ukrainian nationalists, states in his book Pogromchik, during the first 3 days of July 1941, the Nachtigall Battalion, composed almost entirely of Ukrainians under the direction of the Gestapo, slaughtered 7,000 Jews in the vicinity of Lwów, Lemberg. Before their execution, Jewish professors, lawyers, and doctors were made to lick all the steps of four-story buildings and to carry garbage in their mouths from house to house. Then forced to run a gauntlet of men wearing blue and gold armbands, coincidentally the colors of the Petluriist Republic. They were bayoneted to death in what is officially termed Action Petluria. This is like when things get real. It's no longer about like the lies Nazis made up. This is this is all real and very upsetting. Under the Banderite nationalist clique, posing as a government, many of Lviv's non-Jewish writers, intellectuals, and professionals known to be hostile to Nazism were also slaughtered. There's also, for example, the fate of Dr. Taras Malyarchik, a Ukrainian surgeon. Number 15, a surgeon, drowned in bathtub. His wife raped in the presence of their children and then bayoneted. Their 5-year-old daughter, Maria, was thrown out of a window, and their 3-year-old son, Mikhailo, was shot with a small caliber Browning pistol. A Ukrainian Jewish survivor from Kolomyshia describes the barbarism of the Ukrainian nationalists. The moment the Germans came in, the Ukrainian nationalists put on white armbands, and they went on a killing spree. Hidden in a bunker with 17 other people, she remembers. We heard a shot close by. Later, a girl and myself went up quietly from the basement. We looked around, went out. There was a pregnant woman lying. Her baby was moving in her still. She didn't speak, but she was still alive. Then we heard something coming close. We ran away. When I went up from the bunker on that second day, we looked through the window to see what was going on. The picture we saw will never be erased from my mind. 10 or 12 Ukrainian police, walking in their high leather boots, all covered with blood. They went to the well, which was at the end of our street, to wash off the blood. Historian Ruben Einstein has chronicled the widespread and voluntary help given by the Ukrainian nationalists to the Nazi exterminations in Western Ukraine. In his classic, Jewish Resistance in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe, he states that at the beginning of the Nazi occupation, the OUN leaders, Stetsko and Bandera, proclaimed the creation of a free Ukraine and organized a 31,000-strong militia. The militia played a most important part in making it possible for Einsatzkommando to carry out their task of genocide and terror until the middle of August 1941. The militia was then disbanded, and 3,000 cutthroats were allowed to enroll in the Ukrainian Auxiliary Police, which was to play such an abominable role in the annihilation of Jews in Eastern Europe. In the first 8 months of Nazi occupation of Western Ukraine, 15% of Galician Jews, 100,000 people, were slaughtered by the joint actions of the German and Ukrainian nationalists. Jewish Canadian survivor and decorated anti-Nazi partisan Nahum Cohn describes the Ukrainian fascist role in the Holocaust in Ukraine's Volyn region. Whenever Jews were slaughtered, 4 or 5 Germans would participate, helped by 1 or 200 Ukrainian nationalists. When Ukraine was virtually Judenrein, cleansed of Jews, the Banderovsky, OUN Bandera, turned on their Polish neighbors. In his autobiography, Cohn describes how his partisans came to the rescue of the Polish inhabitants of Prishpazia, ravished by the Banderet's fascists, who had slaughtered 40% of the villagers. The Ukrainian nationalist perpetrators of pogroms against the Jews, both before the war and particularly during the war, are portrayed in quite a different light in Ukrainian nationalist publications propagating the famine genocide myth. The first chapter of Black Deeds of the Kremlin opens with a full-page portrait honoring the pogromist leader of nationalist Ukraine, 1918 to 1919, Semyon Petluria. Described by historian Gerald Reitlinger as one of the most dubious national heroes of all time, Petluria was thrown out of Soviet Ukraine by the revolution and joined his lot with the foreign interventionists against the USSR. Hoping to return his nationalist clique on the bayonets of foreign troops. No, wait, I fucked the sentence. Sorry. Hoping to return his nationalist clique on the bayonets of foreign troops, he made a deal with Poland, which gave away Western Ukraine, Galicia, to the Poles through the April 21, 1920 treaty. Nationalist-oriented historian John J. Reshetar admits that while enjoying the hospitality of the Poles during the winter of 1919 to 1920, Petluria met with Pilsudski and became convinced that the sole means of obtaining Allied, and more specifically French, support was by becoming a Polish satellite. Remnants of Petluria's nationalists accompanied the 1920 French-backed Polish invasion of Soviet Ukraine, which was decisively defeated by the Bolsheviks. The Poles held on to Western Ukraine, and Petluria went off to exile in France. Of the so-called leader, even his colleague Volodymyr Vinchenko remembers an unhealthy, ambitious maniac, soaked up to his ears in the blood of pogromized Jewry, politicized illiterate, willing to accept all reaction in order to preserve his power. Assassinated by a Jew, Sholem Schwarzbard in Paris in 1926 as a retribution for the Petluria government army's slaughter of tens of thousands of Jews, Petluria was a symbol used by the nationalists to avenge their quote-unquote great knights. In July 1941, in Lviv, the OUN nationalists declared a day in honor of the memory of Petluria and turned the streets red with the blood of Jewish victims. As Holocaust historian Lucy Dawidowitz states, in Lvov, the Germans and the Ukrainian nationalists, in house-to-house hunts for Jews, shot them randomly on the spot, belatedly avenging the assassination of Petluria, notorious anti-Semite. The Ukrainians staged mammoth pogroms, slaughtering thousands and carrying off thousands of Jews to Einsatzgruppen headquarters. Within hours or days, those Jews who had been taken away were machine-gunned en masse in some remote, desolate area. The disaster was epic. Another full-page Black Deeds tribute honors the Nazi major and murderer Roman Shukovich, a commander of the Bloody Nachtigall Battalion. Following the reorganization of his troops into the Nazi Schutzmannschaft battalions in the summer of 1941, Skushevich, under Nazi direction, led his men into Byelorusia to slaughter partisans, Jews, and peasants. Later in the war, this recipient of the Nazi Iron Cross commanded the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, which Einstein describes as the most dangerous and cruel enemies of surviving Jews, Polish peasants, and settlers, and all anti-German partisans. This is why it's so absurd for Ukraine now to claim that they want to be like the big Israel of Europe, because I mean you literally participated in the Holocaust. So I mean I guess if you mean that Israel is also Nazi, then sure. Also venerated in Black Deeds are a number of clergymen who supported the Nazis, blessed the Ukrainian SS units, or who in other ways politically facilitated the Nazi occupation. Unlike Skripnik, Bishop Maistilev, or Father Vasil Laba, who settled in Edmonton, Metropolitan Andrei Skrupski and Josip Slipke were unable to flee the country with the German regime. They are honored in Black Deeds with portraits. Pro-nationalist historian John Armstrong notes, Shrepsky personally favored the creation of the Galician Division, 14th Waffen-SS, and sent one of his clergy, Dr. Laba, to act as chief chaplain. Bishop Joseph Slipke conducted a service in St. George's Cathedral in Lviv, celebrating the inauguration of the division. You gotta have your war crimes sanctioned by the church, you know? You got to. Upon the capture of Kiev, Metropolitan Shrepsky sent the following message to Hitler. As head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, I send Your Excellency my heartfelt congratulations on the occasion of the occupation of the capital of Ukraine, the Golden Domed City on the Dnieper, Kiev. We see in you the invincible leader of the insuperable and insuperable, inglorious German army. Ew, dude. The cause of this destruction and eradication of Bolshevism, which you, as Führer of the Great German Reich, took as the goal of this campaign, assures Your Excellency the gratitude of all the Christian world. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church knows the historic meaning of the mighty progress of your German nation under your guidance. I shall pray to God for him to bless your victory, bless the victory, which shall be the guarantee of enduring peace for Your Excellency, the German army, and the German nation. Cringe, dude. Cringe. I don't think Jesus would approve. Like the fascist policemen washing their boots at the well, the Ukrainian nationalists of the Banderitsky SS units, auxiliary militia, etc., are confronted with the problem of washing away their blood spilled during the Nazi occupation. Many thousands who fled to Germany and elsewhere in the wake of retreating Nazi armies had to cover up their personal and collective guilt in the Holocaust and betrayal of their country. There is, in fact, a conscious attempt to disguise the past of such persons and to distort the history of the role of Ukrainian nationalists in the Nazi Holocaust. Such cover-ups are sub-themes in the famine genocide campaign, for the credibility of famine genocide allegations is undermined by the direct association with wartime collaboration and atrocities. For example, during a 1984 Winnipeg Teachers Symposium, at which he was speaking on famine genocide, James Mace was asked why he thought the Ukrainian nationalists supported Hitler and the Nazi invasion of Ukraine. Mace replied that they supported Hitler for only a brief period at the beginning of the war. But the relationship between German Nazism and Ukrainian nationalism was no brief honeymoon. Both represented forms of extremist nationalism, which by the late 1920s had reached some common ideological grounds. Two documents from the 1920s indicate the direction of Ukrainian nationalism's transition period. The first is the Decalogue, Decola, the Ten Commandments of Ukrainian nationalism. Originally published in Surma in 1921, all members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists were expected to memorize it. 1. Attain a Ukrainian state or die in battle for it. 2. Do not allow anyone to defame the glory or the honor of your nation. 3. Remember the great days of our efforts. 4. Be proud of the fact that you are an heir of the struggle for the glory of Volodymyr's trident. The trident is a Nazi symbol, and you'll see this, like, Zelensky wears it on his, he has a little pin. He has a pin. 5. Avenge the death of great knights. 6. Do not speak of the cause with whomever possible, but only with whomever necessary. What? 7. Do not hesitate to commit the greatest crime if the good of the cause demands it. Yuck. 8. Regard the enemies of your nation with hate and perfidy. 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 I've heard this word, but I don't know it. Perfidy.
Perfidy.
Quality or state of being faithless or disloyal. Treachery. 9. Neither requests, nor threats, nor torture, nor death can compel you to betray a secret. 10. Aspire to expand the strength, riches, and size of the Ukrainian state, even by means of enslaving foreigners. Yikes! Similarly, if on a more intellectual level one finds unmistakably fascist notions of mystification and the will in V. Voyn's theses on state-minded youth. Oh boy. 1. The clearest feature of a person in the universe is his ability to master his living and non-living environments, even in time and space. Indivisible in their essence, ideas and actions, when systematically executed, are means to this mastery. Beyond them, there is only chaos. The eternal struggle with chaos is the basic task of the person. The ideal is the eventual subjugation of chaos by the person. 2. The greatest imperative for Ukrainians, the struggle for the Ukrainian perfect nation, is simultaneously a struggle against chaos in the familial and societal spheres. This struggle is possible only when, with the training of leaders, who will systematically rule over these spheres, without any compunctions to destroy everything hostile within themselves and in their environment. The creation of such leaders is the basic task of the nation. The ideal is a nation, where every individual exists only for the nation in the name of its perfection. 11. The character of the organization of Ukrainian youth must correspond to the character of the Ukrainian nation. The most fundamental and most famous organization, instinctively accepted by everybody in Ukraine, is that of the military, praised in songs and ballads. Researcher Alexander J. Model comments that Voyn's extremism was probably not untypical for the League, is suggested by a public statement released by the LUN, League of Ukrainian Nationalists, in the late summer of 1926. The only possible form of state rule at the beginning and under present conditions can be a dictatorship of groups of organized Ukrainian patriot nationalists who have state-minded tendencies, a dictatorship, which should be realized in the person that the National Vashte Führer who will organize and complete the liberation of the Ukrainian people. They were literally begging for a Führer. Oh my. By the end of the 1920s, the leadership of exiled Ukrainian nationalists had coalesced around the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists under the Vazd Eugene Konovalets. Established in 1927, the OUN was based on the League of Ukrainian Nationalists, which had been set up at a joint convention of the Union of Ukrainian Fascists, the Ukrainian Nationalist Federation, and the Union for the Liberation of the Ukraine in 1925. The OUN organ, Razbudova Nazi, betrays evidence of the anti-Semitism which was widespread in the Ukrainian nationalist movement. Quote, Ukraine is not jeopardized by the Jews. The latter have not done us, only done us a lot of harm, but will keep doing us harm so long as the Ukrainians fail to apply the necessary means of self-defense, end quote. During the 1930s, the fascist outlook of the OUN, was complemented by a campaign of terror and assassination in Poland. Tactics indicated in the Ukrainian nationalist paper, Meta. Meta? Ukrainian nationalism must be prepared to apply any method of struggle against communism, not excluding mass physical extermination, even if the latter implies sacrificing millions of lives. Even earlier, in November 1930, the OUN journal Razbudova Nazi proclaimed, "We shall be merciless on that great day, which will surely come. There shall be a mercy for neither the young nor the old." It is not surprising that in January 1932, the League of Nations Council branded the OUN a terroristic organization. The affinity of Ukrainian nationalism and Nazism was not confined to Europe. In Canada, anti-Semitism, praise to Hitler, racism, and fascism were openly expressed in Ukrainian nationalist journals in the 1930s. In Winnipeg, a Ukrainian language edition of the infamous anti-Semitic Protocols to the Elders of Zion was published in 1934 and reprinted as late as 1959. The following passage can be found in the October 1938 issue of Church Life, an organ of Ukrainian Catholics in Winnipeg. The greatest man at the present moment is Adolf Hitler. He has changed the map of Europe. Oh my God. And united all the Germans in one state. Together with Mussolini, he has resisted the Bolshevist invasion of Europe, stepped on the necks of Bolsheviks in Spain, and declared that they will not advance beyond their befuddled Russia. Hitler is saving Europe and her culture from the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks. In the same year, the Canadian newspaper of the United Hetman Organization, followers of Hetman Pavel Skoropadsky, stated, "It has become impossible for the French nationalists to call themselves French. The very name invites the attack of Yids, Jews. Billions of Jewish dollars are being mobilized for the pacification of German Gentiles." In similar vein, Novi Shliak, New Pathway, Winnipeg's voice of the OUN's Melnik faction, Ukrainian Nationalist Federation published. In Russia, Git terrorists killed 28 bishops, 1,215 priests, 6,575 teachers, 8,800 doctors. Curious number. 55,850 village elders, 260,000 soldiers, 105,000 policemen, 48,000 gendarmes, 12,500 police chiefs. What police and police chiefs are separate, interesting. Okay. 355,250 intellectuals, 192,000 workers, 815,000 peasants. No one objected. But today, when Jews aren't even beaten, but only frightened, everyone hollers. One notes that while yesterday alleged perpetrators of genocide were labeled Jews, today the label has changed to Russian. Anti-Semitism has a long history in nationalist ideology. A particularly vile example of Nazi-like hate literature appeared in an January 1935 issue of Klich, The Call, published by Anthony Helinka, a social credit member of parliament from Vegreville, Alberta. It blamed the Jews for the famine. This is the descendant of bloodsuckers who exploited Ukraine. His ancestors robbed our fathers of the last strip of land. His ancestors held the keys to our temples. His ancestors were the informers against us. His race barred the path to formation of our state. His race murdered the leader of the Ukrainian Republic. His race besmirched before the world the name of our great Chemlinsky. His race is responsible for the unprecedented terror in Ukraine. His race is murdered by exiles, tortures, and famines. Not only millions of our brothers and sisters, but also millions of innocent children of Ukraine. His race has abused, debauched, and polluted, corrupted, and defiled the majesty of Ukraine. Yeah, this is just Judeo-Bolshevism Part 2. With no mention of anti-Semitism in Klich, Marunchuk writes of Helinka in The Ukrainian Canadians, A History. For his interest in the plight of refugees, A. Helinka soon gained the recognition as being the guardian of third post-war immigration to Canada. The ideological background of Ukrainian nationalism was a contributing factor to support Hitler fascism. Support for Hitler fascism. Ukrainian nationalist ideologue Dmytro Dontsov, who was allowed to settle in Canada after World War II, attempted to justify Hitler's seizure of power in Germany, describing pre-Nazi conditions in part. The third factor of decay was the international Jewish community, who attacked the collapsed country like locusts in order to, jointly with the victors, freely dispose of it, to smear literature, music, and theatrical art with the evils of pornography, to smear pure art with the ideas of Bolshevism. Well connected to Nazi intelligence circles following Hitler's seizure of power, the OUN's fascist views led directly to the wartime alliance with the Third Reich. The xenophobic, anti-democratic, and anti-Semitic nationalism of the OUN meshed easily with Nazism. Following the Konovalets' death in 1939, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists split into two factions. The OUNB, headed by Stepan Bandera, and the OUNM, led by Andrei Melnik. Testimony of German Abwehr officer Erwin Stolze at the Nuremberg war crimes trials revealed that both Melnik and Bandera were on the Nazi payroll prior to Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. It was pointed out that in order for the purpose of delivering a lightning blow against the Soviet Union, Abwehr II must use its agents for kindling national antagonisms among the people of the Soviet Union. I contacted the Ukrainian nationalist socialists who were in German intelligence service and other members of the nationalist fascist groups. Instructions were given by me personally to the leaders of the Ukrainian nationalists, Melnik, codename Consul 1, and Bandera, codename Consul 2, to organize demonstrations in the Ukraine in order to disrupt the immediate rear of the Soviet armies. Apart from this, a special military unit was trained for subversive activities on Soviet territory. Ukrainian nationalist battalions were trained in Germany prior to the war, and some were used by the Nazis in their 1939 invasion of Poland. As the nationalists' own encyclopedia states, the first Ukrainian unit was formed by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists on the eve of the Polish-German War. Approximately 600 men strong, it consisted of former soldiers of the Carpathian Sich, commanded by Colonel Roman Shushko. It marched into Galicia with the German army in September 1939. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, his forces included the Nachtigall and Roland battalions of Ukrainian nationalists. The bloody record of butchery by the Nachtigall battalion of Jews and Poles in Lviv will never be forgotten. The formation of these units is admitted by the Nationalist Encyclopedia. On the eve of World War II, as a result of the agreement between some German authorities and the Bandera OUN faction, two Ukrainian volunteer detachments, Nachtigall and Roland, were formed on German territory. They took part in the military operations of the German army. In late 1941, they were reorganized into the Police Battalion 201 and deployed in Belarus. Thus, we have seen that the Ukrainian nationalist alliance with Nazism predated the beginning of the war, quote unquote. At the same time, the alliance was not without contradictions. While the nationalists pinned their hopes on the Nazis as the vehicle to gain control of Ukraine, the German fascists were not about to cede any part of their power. United by their opposition to the Soviet Union, the Nazis' direct rule of Ukraine also stood as an obstacle to Ukrainian nationalist ambitions. This contradiction has been wildly exaggerated in the post-war cover-up of nationalist collaboration and complicity with the Nazi Holocaust. It is hoped that the retroactive transformation of the junior partner collaborations into anti-Nazi patriots will win them acceptance as allies of democracy, the better to serve the contemporary anti-Soviet crusade. Contemporary to this time being the Cold War Part 2. Ivan Pariani, for example, offers the following alibi in Black Deeds of the Kremlin. Ukrainians are not war criminals because they fought against Hitler and Stalin. They fought against both before the war, and they fought against both during the war. Of course, no one has ever claimed that Ukrainians, as such, are war criminals. I do. I do that. After all, most Ukrainians who were in a position to do so fought against Hitler. But if by Ukrainians, Bariani refers to the nationalists, then he stands condemned as a liar in the stature of Goebbels himself. The Ukrainians who fought Hitler were in fact among the main targets of nationalist armed units. Suits? Oh, armed units. Okay. And who is Ivan Bariani? During the Nazi occupation, he was one of the few Ukrainian writers permitted to have works published through the Nazi-controlled Ukrainian publishing house. That this publisher was Nazi authorized is confirmed by Ukraine, a concise encyclopedia. Late in 1939, by permission of the German authorities, the Ukrainian publishing house, Ukrainsky Vyazkverbo, was established in Krakow, in close association with the Ukrainian Central Committee. The Ukrainian publishing house had the exclusive right to publish Ukrainian newspapers, journals, and books within the general government. One notes that this collaboration commenced in German-occupied Poland, a full year and a half before the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Its authority was later extended to the Nazi-occupied areas of Ukraine, and it also published pro-Nazi Ukrainian papers such as Volgin, 1941 to 44, Krakivitsky Visti, 1940 to 45, and Levitsky Visti, 1941 to 44, to name a few. It was an important tool of German political, literary, and social control over Ukrainians living under occupation. Feverishly casting about for some proof, quote unquote, of anti-Nazi combat, the nationalists and their apologists claim that the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, was actually a patriotic national liberation army, which strove to drive the Nazis from Western Ukrainian territory. The Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta, publisher of the Canadian edition of Conquest Harvest of Sorrow, has published a book in which the OUN Bandera's UPA is even described as being on par with the French resistance. Ihor Kamenetsky, another example, states in Hitler's occupation of Ukraine that nationalists' partisan movement in Ukraine had a considerable influence on the weakening of the German war effort in the East. In reality, the so-called UPA partisans took pressure off the Nazi front lines by helping to clean out the Soviet partisans and secure the German rear areas of supply and occupation. Let us examine the fabric from which authors like Kamenetsky attempt to weave their historical disguise. Kamenetsky utilizes inventions about non-existent clashes between the OUN Bandera's UPA and the Nazis. For example, he claims that the chief of staff of the German SA, Victor Lutze, was killed by a UPA detachment on the highway between Kovel and Brest in May 1934. 1943. 1940. Oh no. The fact that other nationalist historians and their followers give different and contradictory locations for the alleged assassination of Lutze does not add to the credibility of this post-war invention. The truth of the matter is that Lutze was injured in an auto accident near Berlin and died in a Potsdam hospital hundreds of kilometers from where the nationalists claim the UPA killed him. According to Goebbels' diaries, Lutze's funeral was attended by Hitler, Goebbels, and other top-ranking Nazis. As a result of Lutze's mishap, Goebbels writes, Hitler warned the German leadership that cars bearing Nazi party plates must limit their speed to 50 miles per hour. Formed in 1943, the Ukrainske Povodske UPA, the UPA is usually referred to in English as the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, um, sometimes referred to as the Ukrainian Partisan Army, to its surviving Jewish, Ukrainian, and Polish victims. It is usually known as the Banderists, followers of Stepan Bandera's wing of the OUN. Elsewhere, Kamenetsky implies that a German anti-partisan offensive in Volyn was directed against the nationalist UPA. In the big action in the summer of 1943, conducted by SS General Buck Zalewski against the Ukrainian partisans in Volhynia and Polynska, 50 tanks and nearly 10,000 German and auxiliary police were used. In addition, several Hungarian detachments and Eastern volunteer battalions participated. While it is true that the nationalist UPA partisans fought in Volyn in this period, they were not fighting the Nazis. Ruben Einstein writes, it was then that the Soviet partisan leader Alexei Fyodorov-Chernihovsky arrived with his brigade group from the Chernigov region in the area where Brzezinski's brigade was operating. Within a couple of weeks, Fyodorov turned that part of Volyn into partisan territory where Germans had lost all control and began his systematic campaign against the railway network at a time where the Kursk battle was reaching its climax. The Germans assembled a 15,000-strong force made up of SS and Wehrmacht troops, Lithuanians and Vlasov units, and Ukrainian police as well, as well as 5,000 Ukrainian nationalists, and in August launched a massive operation against the partisans. While Fyodorov took the brunt of the fighting against the Germans, Brinsky's brigade, um, Brinsky, I'm over it. Brinsky's brigade was given the task of engaging the Ukrainian Partisan Army (UPA) battalions, which, supported by German bombers and mortar batteries, tried to push the partisans into the bag prepared by the Germans. Composed of criminals and executioners, former members of the hated Ukrainian police, security, gendarmes, SS men, and fascist legionnaires, the UPA and other nationalist gangs were certainly not known for their anti-Nazi combat. As Einstein states, assured of German assistance in arms and, when necessary, outright military cooperation, the UPA gangs, which became known as the Banderovsky, proved themselves under the command of Shushkevich, now known as Taras Chupurinka, the most dangerous and cruel of enemies of surviving Jews, Polish peasants, and settlers, and all anti-German partisans. The fanaticism and nationalistic madness of the Banderovsky, Bolbotsky, and other Ukrainian nationalist gangs reached depths that appeared incredible even to Soviet and Jewish partisans, whose ability to be horrified by what man could do to man was blunted by their daily experiences of the Nazi New Order. The Jewish partisan Bakalshuk Felin has left us a description of entire Polish villages wiped out, their inhabitants invariably tortured and raped before being slaughtered with knives and axes, the babies murdered with the same kind of savagery that had been the fate of Jewish children. Man, again, this is upsetting because we're in the real part. We're in the where it's real. Kamenetsky and his ilk do not have an enviable task in trying to transform Hitler's Ukrainian auxiliaries and terrorists into anti-Nazi partisans. But then, this is not the first time that we have encountered such duplicity in Ukrainian nationalist portrayals of their history. Not surprisingly, and reminiscent of scholarship demonstrated in famine genocide accounts, two-thirds of the evidence for Kamenetsky's assertions come from ideological colleagues. Out of 49 references in Chapter 5 of Hitler's occupation in Ukraine, used as substantiation for the allegedly anti-fascist role of the UPA, no fewer than 28 come from the nationalist apologist Krypchavkevich, and 5 from anti-Semite Petro Mirchuk. It's a Nazi propaganda poster recruiting uh in Canada, I think. Recruiting poster for the 14th Waffen SS Division in Canada. The organization of former members of the 14th Waffen SS is called the Brotherhood of Former Combatants, 1st Ukrainian Division, Ukrainian National Army, and is affiliated with the Ukrainian Canadian Committee. Oh, so this is just a Ukrainian poster, I think. Similarly distorted, if not passed over in silence, as by Mace, is the role of the Ukrainian 14th Waffen-SS Galician Division, also known as the Halichnia Division. Formed in 1943 with the OUN Melnik support and reconstituted after its crushing defeat at Brody in 1944, The 14th Waffen-SS Division's main function was brutal anti-partisan work in several countries. Ukrainian nationalists and their apologists generally seek to give the impression that the Galician Division, unlike other Waffen-SS units, was almost a patriotic Boy Scout organization, with no political attachment to the Nazi cause. History shows otherwise. In his May 1943 appeal for Galicians to join this SS unit, Vladimir Kubijoyevich stated, "The long-awaited moment has arrived when the Ukrainian people again have the opportunity to come out with guns to give battle with its most grievous foe, the Muscovite Jewish Bolshevism." Muscovite Jewish Okay. Muscovite is a new one to me. That's a new slur. Brand new slur just dropped. The Führer of the Great German Reich has agreed to the formation of a separate Ukrainian volunteer military unit under the name SS Riflemen's Division Halichnia. Halichnia. He must stand shoulder to shoulder with the unbeatable German army and destroy once and for all the Jewish Bolshevist monster. Wait, what's this note? Mace's reluctance to discuss the facts of Nazi nationalist wartime collusion at the time, wait, sorry, no, at the previously mentioned Winnipeg's Teachers Symposium is perhaps not surprising. It is well known in the Ukrainian committee that two former general staff members of the 14th Waffen-SS Division settled in Winnipeg after the war and played a prominent part in nationalist activities, including in organizations which today flog the Famine genocide campaign, for which Mace acts as a resource person. These are Osip Navraki, a former chief of the Chancellery of the SS Division who worked for the Administrative Office of the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, and Stepan Volnyets, who served as a columnist for the nationalist paper Ukrainsky Holos. Citing Himmler's speeches contained in the U.S. National Archives, the Canadian Bureau of the Simon Wiesenthal Center describes the unsavory record of this assets unit. On May 16, 1944, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler congratulated the officers of the 14th Waffen-SS Division, Galician Number 1, for having improved the beautiful Ukrainian landscape by ridding it of Jews. Jesus. Himmler added that he was aware that nothing would please the division more than to hand out the same treatment to the Poles, but the timing of that action would be decided by Hitler, the man to whom he had pledged absolute obedience. The 14th Waffen-SS, led by Nazi officers from the top practically down to the company level, with no independent Ukrainian nationalist command, was instrumental in giving military training to the UPA. This is what they were just talking about. Himmler with the Ukrainian nationalists and stuff. That's the paper. Okay. We don't need it. This could have only taken place with the planning, knowledge, and approval of the top SS command and the German officers leading the division. Indeed, certain nationalist historians openly admit that the UPA was assisted by the 14th Waffen-SS. Vasil Veriha, an SS veteran and division historian in Toronto, wrote in Visti Kombatanta, a Ukrainian SS veterans magazine, while recalling the fairly well-known facts that the personnel trained in the division, 14th Waffen-SS, had become the backbone of the UPA. It should be mentioned that the UPA command also sent groups of its people to the division to receive proper military training. This reinforced the UPA, which was left on the native land after the Nazi retreat, in particular, its commanders and instructors. The assessment of the UPA as a Nazi tool appears to be shared by certain sections among the nationalists. Perhaps hoping to distance themselves from the UPA's bloody record, the nationalist publication Ukrainsky Samotinsky admitted that the UPA was influenced by and formed after the Nazi standard and had acquired the whole Nazi mentality. Further, it was not a combat unit of the Ukrainian people, but merely a Ukrainian Waffen-SS, OUN. Ukrainian nationalists' service to Hitler's Third Reich did not end with the expulsion of the Nazis from Ukraine in 1944. As Nazi officer Stotze revealed at the Nuremberg war crime trials, during the retreat of German troops from the Ukraine, Kenar is personally instructed from the Abwehr to set up an underground network to continue the struggle against Soviet power in Ukraine, to organize acts of terrorism, subversion, and espionage. Competent agents were left behind specially to direct the nationalist movement. Orders were given to install caches, to store munitions, etc. To maintain liaison with these bands, agents were sent across the front line. Further, U.S. historian John Armstrong, usually sympathetic to the nationalists, admits that after the Germans were driven out of Ukraine and continuing into early 1945, German military agencies airdropped supplies to UPA units, which most German officers by then regarded as a useful harassment to the Soviet supply lines. As we have seen, collaboration between the Nazis and Ukrainian nationalists began long before the war and continued throughout the war, even after the Germans were completely driven out of Ukrainian territory. The nationalists were firmly locked into the Nazi occupation machine. Their police and punitive units mass murdered Jews and Ukrainians alike. Vast numbers of Ukrainians were also rounded up with the help of Ukrainian collaborators for shipment to Germany as slave laborers. Thousands of actions were carried out by nationalist militias, SB, UPA, and Ukrainian police units, often under German supervision. Nationalists recruited troops, served Hitlers in Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. Ukrainian collaborators assisted in the murder of hundreds of thousands in death camps like Treblinka, Sobibor, Yanovoska, and Travninki. Such was the anti-Nazi struggle, quote unquote, of those whom nationalists today would represent as national liberation fighters, heroes of the Ukrainian people, and patriots of who struggled for a free Ukraine. Nazi collaborators and Nazis themselves. Chapter 10: War Criminals, Anti-Semitism, and the Famine Genocide Campaign. Fain were the hopes of Nazis and nationalists. Defeat and retribution approached like a whirlwind from the east. Fleeing the Soviet offensive with the retreating Germans, nationalist collaborators headed west. After the Allied victory over Nazi Germany, thousands of people dislocated by the war congregated in displaced persons camps in Europe, waiting for resettlement. Many sought to start a new life in North America, Australia, or other countries. Not least among them were large numbers of active collaborators who were in danger of being identified and brought to justice. The Allies had agreed to screen refugees and hold those suspected of war crimes. However, World War II had hardly ended before a new war was in preparation. As early as 1945, the U.S. administration was planning a first strike against the USSR, and in its war plans and preparation, nationalist collaborators also had a role to play. The post-war period introduced new elements into the nationalist famine genocide campaign. For example, its use by some to divert investigations of war criminals. Anti-Semitism, a law, but it's too loud. Oh God, help. Okay. Uh, okay. The post-war period introduced new elements into the nationalist famine genocide campaign. For example, its use by some to divert investigations of war criminals. Anti-Semitism, long a feature of some sections of the nationalist community, has been toned down, but continues to surface. As in the 1930s, the campaign has drawn support from the broader right wing. The campaign is one specific form of a general effort to advance a foreign policy of confrontation with the USSR, not excluding nuclear war. The ascendancy of the American right, represented by the Reagan administration of the 1980s, not coincidentally heralded a revival and elevation of the famine genocide campaign to new heights. The 1980s, sorry, the 1980s campaign finds its roots partly in developments of the early post-war years. As detailed in The Belarus Secret by John Loftus, former attorney for U.S. Justice Department Office of Special Investigations, Western intelligence agencies helped sanitize Nazi collaborators for emigration to new homelands in return for a new collaboration. A particularly important role was played by the U.S. administration's Office of Policy Coordination, headed by Frank Wisner. Wisner? Visner. I don't know. The IRO, International Refugee Organization, as well as the USDP Displaced Persons Commission, had long regarded the Ukrainian Nazis as ineligible for visas and had placed their organizations on the inimical list, but that did not deter Wisner. In a bid to open the gates for Ukrainian and other collaborators, Wisner asserted the OUN, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and the Partisan Army it created in 1942, UPA, fought bitterly against both the Germans and the Soviet Russians. Here one sees the thesis of nationalist anti-Nazi combat in one of its earliest forms. A cover story used by American intelligence to smuggle Ukrainian and other East European Nazis into the United States following the war. Loftus comments, "This is a complete fabrication. The CIC, U.S. Counterintelligence Corps, had an agent who photographed 11 volumes of the secret internal files of the OUN Bandera. These files clearly show how most of its members worked for the Gestapo or SS as policemen, executioners, partisan hunters, and municipal officers." The OUN contribution to the German war effort was significant, including the raising of volunteers for several SS divisions. It was precisely because of its work with the Nazis that Wisner wanted to hire the OUN for his special forces. It's because they were collaborating with the Nazis that they hired them. Literally because, like, that's like a point on their resume. It's not like an accident or an, like, oversight, you know? Um, Weisner's letter on behalf of the OUN fascists succeeded in convincing immigration officials to take the OUN Bandera organization off the inimical list. By the time the DP Act, Displaced Persons Act, had expired in 1952, 400,000 immigrants had come to the United States. Among them were important Nazi collaborators from Belarus, the Ukraine, including the nucleus of Wisner's special forces. During the same 4-year period, Wisner's OPC enjoyed virtually unlimited freedom of action and had grown to the point that it was consuming more than half of the CIA's annual budget. Wisner's private army had launched an undeclared war against the Soviet Union. He had defied the congressional ban on smuggling Nazis. He had misappropriated government funds to buy arms for ex-Nazi terrorists. And he had obstructed justice by sheltering fugitive war criminals who had been denounced by the Nuremberg Tribunal, the United Nations, and the Congress of the United States. Shocking? Are you shocked? Frank Wisner and the Office of Policy Coordination did not, however, operate outside of the overall plan of the U.S. administration for war against the Soviet Union. Declassified documents of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Council boldly outline the American preparations for war, including readiness for first use of nuclear weapons. National Security Council Directive 4A of December 1947 sketches the directions of covert activities. Psychological warfare included primarily media-related activities, including unattributed publications, forgeries, and subsidization of publications. Political action involved exploitation of dispossessed persons and defectors, and support to political parties. Paramilitary activities included support to guerrillas and sabotage. Economic activities consisted of monetary operations. Laundered East European collaborators were put to work at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the Voice of America, and schools training U.S. intelligence officers in East European languages. Some were trained for sabotage operations inside the Soviet Union. Others were employed as living witnesses of communist terror in the psychological conditioning of the American people for war against the USSR. The Ukrainian famine genocide was but one of many themes. Their interests coincided with those of the U.S. administration. George Kennan writes in his memoirs, "It was the existence in our country of one vocal and not uninfluential element that not only wanted war with Russia, but had a very clear idea of the purpose for which, in its own view, such a war should be fought. I have in mind the escapees and immigrants, mostly recent ones, from non-Russian portions of the post-war Soviet Union, as well as from some of the Eastern European satellite sites. Their idea, to which they were passionately and sometimes ruthlessly attached, was simply that the United States should, for their benefit, fight a war against the Russian people to achieve the final breakup of the traditional Russian state and the establishment of themselves as the regimes of various quote-unquote liberated territories. They appealed successfully, at times, to religious feeling, and even more importantly, to the prevailing anti-communist hysteria. An idea of the political power they possessed can be had from the fact that some years later, 1959, they were able to recommend to Congress, through their friends there, the text of a resolution, the so-called Captive Nations Resolution, every word of which was written, on his own published admission, by their spokesman, Dr. Lev E. Dobryansky, then associate professor of Georgetown University, and to get this document solemnly adopted by Congress as a statement of American policy. This resolution committed the United States, insofar as Congress had the power to do so, to the liberation of 22 nations, two of which had never had any real existence, and the name of one of which appears to have been invented in the Nazi propaganda ministry during the recent war. Hi, Luna. Hi. Everyone follow Luna. Um, any questions, any comments, any thoughts? The anti-communist communists are baffling. Indeed. Indeed. I don't get it. Oh, hi, Stren. And see you come in there. Da 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 da. My thoughts are I hate computers. Me too. Big same. Okay. As one of the anarchists, no, sorry, anarchists, fuck. As one of the architects of the Cold War, containment policy of the United States, Kennan could hardly have been shocked at this point by the byproduct of the CIA in furthering U.S. policy. The United States was not only the what the, oh okay, sorry, God, words. I can read, I swear. I can read. Okay. The United States was not the only destination after World War II. Allowed to enter Canada, particularly after the launching of the Cold War, were former members of the terrorist Ukrainian insurgent army, Ukrainian police, punitive detachments, security police, concentration camp guards. Nor should one forget the political collaborators, propaganda writers, and labor procurers from the Melnik and Bandera wings of the OUN. Most notable was the Canadian government decision in 1950 to admit en masse members of the Galician Waffen SS division. This is just the actual agent report, declassified, from the CIA. Cited here, I assume. Yeah. Declassified U.S. intelligence document describing the Nazi career of Ukrainian nationalist collaborator Pavel Shronduk. Besides serving as a Gestapo agent, Shronduk headed the 1st Ukrainian Division, the 14th Waffen SS, following its cosmetic name change in April 1945. Stronduk's service dates back to his role as a pogromchik leader during the 1919 mass murder of Jews by Petluria's Ukrainian nationalist forces. See Saul Friedman. This is kind of hard to read. Maybe it's easier over here. Fronduk was the chief of police for the Imperial Russian government in the Poltava region. In 1916, he was inducted into military service and attended military school at Chushev. I can't even read it. As a cadet, he was disqualified from the same and was assigned as a sergeant to a rear echelon unit of the army. In this assignment, he rose to the rank of junior lieutenant and transferred to the outbreak of the revolution to the Ukrainian army with the rank of a captain. There he became an adjutant to Padlura FNU, who promoted him within a short time to a colonel. In 1920, he served with the Ukrainian army in Poland, and after his release, entered Polish military service as an agent for the counterintelligence. In 1923, he attained the rank of major in Quartermaster Corps after graduating from the military academy in Warsaw. Warsaw, you say? In what year? Okay. Okay. All right. Got a new sword. Nice. Okay, I don't think the rest of this is very important. Okay, now I need to go back here. Accorded special treatment. They were allowed into Canada years before the ban on other SS units was lifted. What do you mean before the ban on other SS units was lifted? They just they unbanned all the SS units? Is that what? I don't know why I'm shocked. Okay. Under Nazi command, the 14th Waffen-SS Division had cut its retreat through Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, fighting the partisans and the masses of people rising up against the Nazi yoke. Some had served the Nazis in their defense of Budapest. Just prior to Germany's surrender on April 24, 1945, the division changed its name to the 1st Division of the not existent Ukrainian National Army in an effort to disguise its SS background. Other Ukrainian fascist units, such as the Bloody 31st Punitive Detachment, were incorporated into the division prior to the surrender. The rechristened SS unit was headed by the notorious General Pavel Schranduch, a turncoat from the pre-war Polish army with a long record of Nazi service. Following the Nazi surrender, the main body of the division was interned by the British in a camp in Rimini, Italy. Ukrainian nationalists abroad set up relief communities, quote unquote, to get these collaborators and others out of the displaced persons and internment camps and into countries such as Canada and the United States. In Canada, a key role was played by the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, UCC, prominent today in the prominent today in the Famine genocide campaign. The film Harvest of Despair was made under its auspices. The UCC was founded in November 1940 by the Brotherhood of Ukrainian Catholics, the Ukrainian Self-Reliance League, and the League of Ukrainian Organizations, and the pro-fascist United Hetman Organizations and Ukrainian National Federation. Citing documents from the Public Archives of Canada, Toronto's Simon Wiesenthal Centre has outlined the active role played by Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, in the formation of the Ukrainian Canadian Committee. Ukrainian Canadian. Say that 10 times fast. The Hetman Organization, the Wiesenthal Center's notes, sought to restore the monarchy of the Ukraine and establish a military dictatorship based on Italian fascism. Publishers of The New Pathway, the Ukrainian National Federation, had a pre-war record of glorifying the Nazi regime and Hitler. Help. Even Watson Kirkconnell, honorary advisor to the coordinating committee which led to the formation of the UCC, had previously acknowledged that the UNF were Ukrainian Nazis. Noting that the UNF was the Canadian branch of the OUN, Melnik followers, Kirkconnell wrote that this organization was anti-Semitic, markedly military, authoritarian, and anti-democratic, and has been outlawed in Poland for their campaigns of murder and terrorism. A confidential 1940 report to the Department of War Services described the UNF as rabid admirers of the Nazi system. In 1946, Ukrainian Canadian Committee President Wasyl Kushner visited the SS men in Rimini, some of whom were still dressed in their Nazi uniforms. Upon Kushner's return to Canada, the UCC lobbied to secure their entry into Canada. This was seemingly difficult. SS members were barred from entry. Appearing before the Senate's Standing Committee on Immigration and Labor, Kushner was asked if military men were among the displaced persons under discussion. Kushner replied in the negative, supporting Senator David's claim that the SS men were workmen by adding that they had been forcibly deported. Man, what? The formal barrier to SS members faded in importance as the Cold War deepened. Of more concern to the Canadian Immigration Department was whether or not an applicant was or had been a communist. Thus, an anti-Nazi partisan of left persuasion, or one who had fought under left-wing leadership against the German occupation in many European countries, the major part of the resistance movements, stood to be turned away. In contrast, former Nazi SS men were admitted by the thousands. Even prior to the admission of the members of the 14th Waffen SS Division, certain Canadian authorities were complicit in the facilitating of the entry of SS members. In December 1947, a member of the Ontario legislature on a fact-finding tour of Europe wrote from Germany to Saul Hayes, the director of the Canadian Jewish Congress, that RCMP officers screened and approved about a dozen men who had been stopped by the doctor before boarding ship because the doctor had discovered the SS mark tattooed under their armpit. What? I'm sorry. They put it under their armpit? Like right here, they put SS? That sounds painful as fuck, first off. Most painful place for a tattoo that I could even imagine. Yeah, where it sucks. We do between the toes, friend. What? I'm sorry, what? I'm sorry. What? I did not know about this. I thought they just like put it on their shoulder. Is that just now? Now they put like, you know, the three percenters or the whatever various Nazi group. Had their military stuff tattooed there in case they were blown up. Oh. Oh. Oh, yeah, so an arm might get blown off, but, you know, at least you can find the torso. I get you. Interesting. Christ. Okay. All right. Does the IDF do that too? Is there like a fucking IDF branding? I assume they just brand them. All right. No sooner had they settled into their new environment than the political activists among them sought out or were approached for new alliances within the Cold War political and academic arenas. Canadian Nazi investigator Saul Littman, for example, has stated, to gather information on Soviet bloc countries, they, the RCMP, have cultivated the radical right-wing nationalists in the Baltic, Ukrainian, Hungarian, Romanian, Croatian, and Polish-Canadian communities. New Wave nationalists rose rapidly in the ranks of the American and Canadian organizations, some of which had been weakened and depleted during the war years due to their earlier pro-Nazi leanings. Adding some thousands of new members, the new arrivals eventually came to dominate the leadership of the right wing in the Ukrainian community, giving the movement a new lease on life. In Canada, for example, a number of post-war Ukrainian exiles of OUN Melnik loyalties joined the Ukrainian National Federation. New organizations were also set up, such as the Society of Veterans of Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the OUN Banderas UPA, the Brotherhood of Former Combatants, 1st Division, Ukrainian National Army, alias of the 14th Waffen SS, and the OUN Banderite League for the Liberation of Ukraine. These groups eventually affiliated to the Ukrainian Canadian Committee. Former fascists, Nazi collaborators, and SS men are to be found throughout the ethnic and political associations dominated by certain nationalist tendencies. Some prominent Ukrainian nationalists openly brag of the influence wielded by former SS members in Ukrainian right-wing organizations. Former Ukrainian SS man Mykola Stepanenko, who reportedly has done work for both Radio Liberty and Radio Canada, addressed a banquet celebrating an anniversary of the 14th Waffen SS Division in Toronto. Speaking as a representative of the government center of the Ukrainian Nationalist Republic, he boasted, "I share your conviction that former members of the 1st Ukrainian Division are today found in all Ukrainian organizations, societies, and institutions, that they are among the leaders of every such organization. They hold responsible posts at private enterprises functioning in a variety of government and public capacities in the education system, from public schools to universities. All of them went through the school of life in the division, and they are not ashamed of it." So they're like proud Nazis. It's Is that supposed to make me feel better or something? God. While Stepanenko and others may not be ashamed of their former membership in the SS, the general trend in the Ukrainian nationalist movement has been to cover up nationalist complicity in Nazi Germany's crimes. A new image and clean clothes were collectively required, which would obscure past collaborations with the Nazis and enable them to pick up the shattered pieces of their anti-communist struggle from new bases in the West. One need only examine the numerous institutions, quote unquote, set up to develop the history of Ukrainian nationalism to a fine art of apologetics. The vast bulk of Western material on Ukrainian history, culture, and politics is manufactured by exiled right-wingers and their liberally funded academic institutions. Such institutions, as the Shrevenko Scientific Society, Smolay Skip Publishers, the Ukrainian Academy of Arts and Sciences, New York, the Ukrainian Free University in Munich, try to pass off nationalist interpretations of history as representing the views and aspirations of all Ukrainians in the world. Oh, I missed the asterisk. Where's the asterisk? Oh, it's after the quote here. Former members of the 14th Waffen SS, alias 1st Ukrainian Division, are not found in all Ukrainian organizations. All Ukrainian organizations are not nationalist, and only a minority of Ukrainian Canadians and Americans have been associated with right-wing nationalist organizations. Nationalists' claims to speak not only for all Ukrainians abroad, but for Ukraine as well, are patently ridiculous. True. True and real. Frank Wisner and the Office of Policy Coordination played a direct role in the 1950s in establishing emigre institutes. John Loftus notes further, funding these research institutes, which were little more than front groups for ex-Nazi intelligence officers, came from the American Committee for Liberation from Bolshevism, now known as Radio Liberty. The committee was actually a front for OPC. Many of these institutions continue to be generously assisted by various public and private sources, openly or covertly. In the United States, a Village Voice expose drew attention to the Prologue Research and Publishing Association, Inc. for its purpose. the investigation of history, economics, politics, and culture of the Ukraine, exposing the public opinion of the world to the true nature of communist dictatorship and to the threat to freedom everywhere. Prologue certificate filed in New York in 1956 lists the Ukrainian Nazi war criminal Mykola Lebed as a director. According to the Village Voice, Lebed heads an OUN faction, for which Prologue was at least partly a front group. The Village Voice comments, Ukrainians familiar with the workings of Prologue say that it could not have sustained itself solely from the sales of its publications, many of which were regularly smuggled into Ukraine, and that it probably received help from government agencies. Several people interviewed mentioned the CIA. No way. No way. In Canada, nationalists and anti-communists dominate some universities' Ukrainian and East European studies departments. They appear to have had a free hand to publish propaganda as history. Such studies departments, gilded by the name of respected universities, are not only the means of perpetuating the ideological positions of Ukrainian nationalism, but strive to elevate and insinuate them into more broadly accepted history. As such, they serve the ideological armory of the Cold War right wing. In deference to more respectable North American approaches to anti communism, contemporary nationalist material has generally toned down or quietly abandoned former Nazi like and Jew baiting themes. Perhaps this underlies Robert Conquest's wishful assertion that, generally speaking, Ukrainian nationalism as it now exists is of a liberal and generous type. However, anti-Semitism has not been completely relegated to history. It continues to rear its head in allegations of famine genocide, and particularly in response to investigation of war criminals. A particularly vicious example is the book Why Is One Holocaust Worth More Than Others, published in 1986 by the veterans of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA. Double Holocaust theory. Classic. Classic. Written by a former UPA member using the name Yuri Shumatsky, the book sees history as a Jewish plot in classic fascist fashion. Its main argument runs as follows: the Jews are to blame for the deliberate famine of 1932 to 33, which it is claimed killed more Ukrainians than Hitler, and his Ukrainian auxiliaries killed Jews in the war. No one, therefore, dare accuse post-war Ukrainian nationalists of harboring collaborators and war criminals. Such accusations use faked Moscow Zionist evidence. Zionist, you say? Classic. People still say this shit. Well, Stalin supported Israel. No, the fuck he didn't. No, he didn't. Oh, gosh. Okay. Stretching. Stretchy. Oh, God. Oh, God. I just dislocated a rib. Oh, no. When you stretch too much. When you stretch too hard. Ow. Okay. Okay. Mm. To play up the fabrication of famine genocide, the Holocaust against the Jews is downplayed and dismissed as an assertion of Zionist Jews. From the beginning, The cause of anti-Semitism is seen as Jewish obstinacy and arrogance. The figure of 6 million Jewish victims is discounted as an allegation, and the reader is told that the Holocaust against the Jews is merely being used as Israel's #1 propaganda weapon. Jesus. In sympathy with those who deny the Holocaust, such as Canadian racists Jundal and Keegstra, Chumatsky states revisionist historians who claim there was no plan to exterminate the Jews, there were no mass gassings, and that fewer than 1 million Jews died of all causes during World War II, are persecuted and their books banned by trade boycott. They have been persecuted in the courts in the USA, West Germany, and Canada. They are subject to character assassinations in the media. The real Holocaust, contends Chumatsky, was caused by Jew/Bolsheviks. He states, according to Zionist statements, Hitler killed 6 million Jews, but Stalin, supported by the Jewish state apparatus, was able to kill 10 times more Christians. Alleging that Jewish financiers backed the Russian Revolution, that Jews made up the leadership and were responsible for the 60 to 65 million Gentile deaths, Chomsky relies on anti-Semitic mythology to explain the causes of the 1932 to 33 famine. In answer to his own question, why was the famine created, Chomsky states, having the majority of the USSR administration, the Jews were involved in all decision-making, including the settlement of Jews in Ukraine and Crimea, plus the plan to build Zion in Ukraine. Wait, what? Huh? Planning the Ukrainian famine was still a few years into the future. Disarming Ukraine with false promises of amnesty and further intimidating the populace by judicial process, Russia then took steps to implement the famine plan. The Jewish farmers were warned in advance and they got their homesteads moving to nearby cities and villages. What? What? They left their homesteads, moving to nearby. Okay, sure. The Jewish population did not starve, as the warning enabled them to store food in anticipation. Having thinned out Ukraine by planned famine for the purpose of Jewish colonization, the reader is told that the Jew-controlled, quote-unquote, Western press suppressed news of the famine. The Irish Gentile writer Durante is even labeled a Jewish journalist in support of the thesis of Jewish sympathizers covering up a genocide. Current investigations of the Ukrainian war criminals are therefore misdirected, it is claimed. In support, the book offers the following statement by Yaroslav Stetsko, wartime Ukrainian fascist leader who, after the war, headed up the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations until his recent death. Today, power is exercised by the Muscovite subhuman. The flaccid West acts as if no one saw that the real subhuman is not the wrong Ivan Demjaniak, but the creatures who occupy the Kremlin. The Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy theme is also recalled in the reaction of certain other Ukrainian nationalists to the possible extradition or prosecution of Ukrainian war criminals. Under the heading Ukrainians on Trial, thanks to the Soviet Jewish witnesses and documents, the nationalist journal Epka Ekran states, often it is very painful when one hears, reads, sees, in the so-called media, sensational and purposeful commentaries, reports about crimes of Ukrainians against the Jews and the collaboration of the former with the Germans. Where are our educational institutions? UVON, NTSH, departments of Ukrainian studies, social organizations, political parties, UCCA, CUC, CUC, WCFU, churches, professional associations who would take a public position in the English language press in regards to the falsity of the witnesses, Soviet Jewish witnesses, and KGB documentations. The oft planned Jewish campaigns against the accused, tried by American courts. Her immigration must defend the Ukrainian honor in a general and abstract manner, and not in a singular understanding before Western courts. That is, compactly oppose false Soviet documentations and their supposed witnesses' tendentiousness, tendentiousness with politically forged Jewish witnesses who have unlimited access to American news media. The Canadian government's decision to establish a commission to investigate the presence in Canada of war criminals, the Deschnes Commission, Deschines Commission, maybe, provoked somewhat similar responses. Canada's newspaper for Ukrainian studies, Student, stated, for example, the Jewish community throughout has led an urbanized existence, attempting to always be at the political and commercial forefront, exerting influence on decision-making processes to benefit themselves wherever possible. The appointment of the Deschnes Commission is but one result of their efforts. Student attributes the silence of the few Ukrainians in any position to speak out on this matter with any degree of credibility to the fear of backlash from within their professional lives. They're well aware of the formidable Jewish presence in all areas of employment and avoid biting the hand that feeds them. Yeah, it couldn't be that you're a Nazi and no one likes you because you're a Nazi. That couldn't be it. Even more repugnant are comments made by Father Myron Stasiv on Toronto radio station in February 1985. Stasiv, a former member of the 14th Waffen SS Division, still carries his SS tattoo and shows no shame at having been a member of that dirty outfit. A prominent member of the Ukrainian Nationalist Community, Stasiv was elected president of the Association of Ukrainian Nationalists, affiliated to the Ukrainian Canadian Committee in April 1987, stating that if such a thing existed as Ukrainian war criminals, they would be considerably less numerous than the Jewish war criminals. Stasiv repeats the old slanders once circulated by Ukrainian reactionaries. God. The Jews and their hatred for Ukrainians go back 300 years and more, but they do not say what the causes of these Jewish pogroms were. Those who had the keys to the Christian churches and would not allow the people to enter to pray. Sure, Jan. They were the tavern keepers who robbed the peasants of their lands for whiskey and made them their serfs. The Jews likewise do not speak about how the Jews poured molten tar in boiling water and stoned the heads of Ukrainian Petliura nationalists, soldiers, in Bertizhev in 1918, at the same time of the Ukrainian state. How many Jews were there in the governments of Leiba Trotsky? Consider the achievements of Kaganovich as Commissar of Ukraine in the years of the famine of 1932 to 33, when more than 7 million Ukrainians perished from artificial famine. 7 million. Well, we had 1 more million. What now? Mm. A related theme, seen also in Why is One Holocaust Worth More Than the Others, has become particularly popular in nationalist protests against investigation of war criminals. That is, to project the concept that communism equals fascism plus, to depict the Soviet Union as having committed a genocide as great as or even greater than Hitler's genocide against the Jews. For example, Shulekevich writes to the editor of the Winnipeg Free Press. Hitler annihilated about 11 million in his genocidal operations. Stalin had at least 29 million killed. Oh my god, 29. Promise? The writer goes on to berate Jewish organizations for insisting that Nazi documents and other evidence from the USSR be used by the Canadian Government Commission investigating war crimes. Similarly, in an apparent attempt to divert attention from the trial then underway in Israel of John Demjanjuk, the former Ukrainian SS man accused of operating the Treblinka gas chamber, a Mr. Onishoko writes, the Russians pioneered the use of gas chambers in 1938 in Vorkuta. It is an old communist trick to use gas chambers to destroy those fighting the Russian monsters. What? Nationalist campaigns, such as that alleging Soviet genocide in the Ukrainian famine, are thus used to deflect examination of nationalist complicity in the fascist crimes. This, though, is a secondary aim. The primary purpose served by the famine genocide campaign is to contribute to psychological conditioning for confrontation and war against the Soviet Union. This is seen by some of the what? My brain just gave up. It just gave up on me mid-sentence. This is seen by some to be the method by which to make the nationalist dream of an independent Ukraine a reality. Okay, maybe I need a break. How long is this? Why can't I finish a chapter? Okay, 132. Oh my god, we're so close. I can do it. I can do this. I swear. Okay. Orange Juche. Hi, AJ. Hold. In 1920, Ukrainian nationalists looked to interventionist Poland and its invasion of Soviet Ukraine as the vehicle for gaining power. From the fuck. I can do it. From the mid-1930s through World War II, Nazi Germany was seen as the means to the nationalists' end. In the post-war period, the United States had been seen as holding the promise of realizing the goal of a nationalist-ruled Ukraine. U.S. policies based on hostility and distrust toward the USSR and the nuclear war are seen as necessary for this purpose. The following statement from the Ukrainian nationalist paper Homen Ukraini would indicate that some nationalists are pinning their last hopes for a return to Ukraine. or rather to her ashes, on a nuclear strike against the USSR. We regard the threat of a third world war as it approaches humanity as our last, perhaps the aptest chance. Even if one half or more of humanity were to perish in this war, we wouldn't consider it too exorbitant a price in order to gain our freedom. That's super genocidal. Wow. I can't highlight. I can't highlight on this. I do usually do that. In a similar fit of madness, the Ukrainian nationalist paper Svoboda declared, in several years from now, the American president will have only two things to choose between. Either to start a nuclear war against the USSR, or to yield to Moscow. In support of American plans to deploy neutron bombs in Europe, former Nazi collaborator and exiled UN leader Yaroslav Stetsko stated, in a war against the Warsaw Treaty countries, NATO hasn't a chance of winning victory by conventional weapons unless it deploys neutron weapons in Europe. Among all the different types of nuclear weapons, it is the most humane. The use of tactical nuclear weapons does not mean a universal nuclear war. Not to be outdone, Visivolny Shliak stated, the USSR's existing any further poses a greater threat to the world than a nuclear cataclysm. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Outside the nationalist movement, in a broader context, the Famine genocide campaign is one cog of the wheel of psychological warfare against the USSR in the US military machine. Declassified US documents of the late 1940s and 1950s clearly link an offensive policy against the Soviet Union and its defeat with the perceived interests of the United States. In the 1980s, the US administration has re-emphasized official policy legitimizing first use of nuclear weapons, preemptive nuclear attack, and theories of limited and winnable nuclear war. An atmosphere of direct confrontation with the USSR has been promoted, using the language of blackmail and threats characteristic of US President Ronald Reagan's crusade against communism. Carefully cultivated is the image of a Soviet evil empire prepared to launch a conventional war or nuclear war to achieve world domination. One must be aware of appeasement, the argument goes, and pursue a position of military strength. The evil empire image rests, if only in small measure, on the interpretation of the 1932-33 famine as a deliberate, pre-planned genocide of millions of Ukrainians. Cold War confrontation, rather than historical truth and understanding, has motivated and characterized the famine genocide campaign. Elements of fraud, anti-Semitism, degenerate nationalism, fascism, and pseudo-scholarship revealed in this critical examination of certain key evidence presented in the campaign and of the political purpose and historical background of the campaign's promoters underline this conclusion. Over 50 years ago, American journalist Louis Fisher exposed the fakery and political motives of the pro-fascist publisher William Randolph Hearst. In examining the record of those propagating the famine genocide campaign today, one is drawn to Fisher's conclusion. The attempt is too transparent, and the hands are too unclean to succeed. This book is really, really good. It's really, really good. Okay, so it's all going to be on my YouTube. If you've missed the previous parts, you can watch it on Twitch right now, or, you know, the beginning part is on YouTube, but I still have to edit the last 4 chapters now and post that. Do we need to read the appendix, do you think? Do read appendix or not read appendix? Appendix. From Third Reich propagandist to Famine genocide author. Eyewitnesses are among the most effective sources used in famine genocide propaganda. The scholarly weakness of such evidence has been generally noted. It is not possible to examine each specific individual's story. One must suffice. One must suffice. That's so true. So true, bestie. It's so real. One must suffice. Just like me for real. Among the many testimonies in Black Deeds of the Kremlin is one by Alexa Haloko. At the time of the book's publication, this man was living in Winnipeg under the false name Borislavsky, a name he used until 1958, when he reverted to his wartime name. Discussions with post-war Ukrainian immigrants and information from various research organizations revealed that Halako was left out, has left out some parts of his story. An identification card issued in Krakow, Poland, on November 14, 1942, under Hans Frank's general government, identifies Halako as a Nazi-approved Schriftsteller, or writer. The document is stamped Berlin, indicating the highest official Nazi approval. Born on August 12, 1910, in Pasarivka, his status is given as married. His birth date and place of birth should be borne in mind, for, as will be shown, Haloko keeps changing particulars on documents prior to and after Germany's surrender. Haloko was also granted a work pass issued through Volodymyr Kubijovic Ukrainischer Hauptausschuss, Ukrainian Central Committee. This German-controlled collaborationist front was set up in Krakow in 1940 by the Nazis and Ukrainian nationalists, long before the invasion of the Soviet Union. The work pass, issued in 1943, declares Haloko to be a member of the Lviv Writers Association. It bears the extremely low certification number of 7, which would seem to indicate that he was among the very first to sign up for the Nazi-approved association. The affixed photograph clearly matches his post-war photos. According to one of his books published decades later in Canada, Haloko had work approved and published under Nazi authority during the occupation of Ukraine. In addition, it has been reported from Ukrainian immigrant sources in Canada that he worked alongside Nazi officers in attempts to recruit Soviet prisoners to fight for Hitler, such as at the POW camp in Borislav. Okay, so these are the photos which I need to go here for. Wait, I don't know if these are TOS. Hold. Hold. What? Appendix. Okay, there it is. Okay. No, it's just. Oh, it's just his documents. It's just his documents. It's safe. You can see this. Picture. Wow. Wow, picture. Document. Wow. Such picture, many document. Christian name. Christian name. Alexander. I didn't know this was the thing. What do you mean, Christian name? Christian name. What? Huh? What? Before and after. Above, Hey Holoko's Nazi authorized membership card for the Writers Association. Note low membership number. Below, after the Nazi surrender, SS man Hey Holoko uses an alias and false identification papers under the name Hajevix. I don't know how to say this. To escape detection. My name is just Alexander. I'm just a I'm just a guy. Okay. Okay. Oh, there's a broken. Okay. Hey Holoko's personal wartime writings state that in August 1944, he was sworn into the SS and received his SS tattoo under the left arm. Nazi Germany's surrender found Hey Holoko in Austria, where, incidentally, thousands of Ukrainian SS men emerged after retreating from Yugoslavia and elsewhere. In the panic and scramble of the last days of the war, many Nazis and collaborators tried to exchange identities and to finish up the war in the British and American zones. The SS Halichina Division and other Ukrainian fascist forces reconstituted themselves, with German consent, as the first Ukrainian division of the non-existent Ukrainian National Army, immediately prior to the Nazi surrender, a tactic devised to avoid retribution. Since the Allies had agreed that all SS formations were criminal organizations, there were initially a lot of nervous collaborators looking for safety. Hey Holoko seems to have been no exception. 2 identically printed travel passes were made out for the 12,445 train. Wait, no. This is points. Wait. 12.4.45 train from Linz to Feldkirch. One is for Alexei Haloko, born 12/18/1910. The other for Alexander Hajevich, born 12/10/1912. Undoubtedly, such documents could come in handy if checked by certain Allied authorities. That, though, was just the beginning. In Kamsach, Tyrol, he was issued a Bescheinigung on June 1 under the name Alexei Holoko, born 12/8/1910. The certificate indicates the presence in a displaced persons camp and bears the signature of the local burgermeister Herr I.A. Wolf. A police form dated June 16, 1945, reveals Hey Holoko to have been registered in Innsbruck under the same name Alexander Hajevich, born 12/10/1912, in Sanok. His last place of residence is given as Vienna. Yet another document, dated June 22, 1945, appears to be a falsely obtained identity card for the Ukrainian High School Students' Union at Innsbruck. Identified as a philosophy student, his alias is given a modified Polish spelling, Alexander Hajewicz. Born 12/10/1912 in Sanok. Less than a month later, a police document issued July 19, 1945, is made out to Alex Haj Holoko, born 12/8/1910 in Pisarvika, matching that given on the Nazi-approved documents from Lviv during the war. The last place of residence is given as Kramsak, and the occupation as writer. By means of the photographs, it becomes unmistakably clear that Hajevich, and Hey Holoko are one and the same person. On his Austrian obtained documents, Holoko claimed to be unmarried. In fact, he was married in Lviv, Lemberg, on February 14, 1942, to Alexandra Kusikeva. Not only did he desert his wife, but a young son as well. Yaroslav Holoko was born on August 24, 1942 in Lviv, the birth being recorded at St. George's High Cathedral. Although professing to be Greek Orthodox in his post-war documents, the marriage and baptism took place in the Roman Catholic Church. Sorry, the Roman Church. No divorce was obtained from this marriage. Thus, we see a person on the run, taking extraordinary pains to conceal not only his real identity, but also his exact location, destinations, places of residence, and dates thereof. One suspects that some documents were made out in advance of the particulars indicated, and others later than described. Given the black market in identity passes and other documents among those hiding from the past, such maneuvers were entirely feasible. The recent book, We Accuse, documentary sketch by Ukrainian writer and researcher Valery Strykul, contains very interesting material on Holoko. Strykul is also an author of a book on the organization and the atrocities committed by members of the 14th Waffen SS Division in Ukraine, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. Where was Alexa Holoko in early June 1941, when the cream of Lviv's intelligentsia and thousands of innocent Jewish men, women, and children were being slaughtered by Ukrainian fascists during the nationalists' first exercise in government since Petluria? According to Strykul, N N N that pseudo administration, Alexo Holoko was made propaganda minister. Oh my. There was it coincidental that Holoko found himself among such members of the government as Stetsko, Lebed, Shukevich, and others. He hated Jews as much as they did. After the war started, he even wrote these poetic, or rather, fanatic, cannibalistic lines. Oh no, not the cannibalism again. May a hurricane sweep the world clean of the hateful Jews. Death, formidable and wrathful, has already sounded his trumpet. He is towering over you, scythe in hand, because the damned Jews hung around St. Sophia. Jeez. Us. Christ. Okay. Okay. Holoko, not surprisingly, totally omits any mention of his role as propaganda minister in his published memoirs. While presenting himself as having a most phenomenal memory of trivial details and alleged conversations going back half a century, Holoko suffers amnesia when it comes to the pinnacle of his political career. That's good. That's good. This lapse of memory, however, is not shared by the Bandera wing of the Ukrainian nationalist movement. The Banderist book, The Restoration of the Ukrainian State in World War II, not only lists him in the lineup of the so-called government, but honors him with a photograph. This you? Stetsko's OUN Bandera government lasted only 10 days and a few more pogroms before being replaced by direct Nazi German rule. According to Strykul, Holoko was subsequently trained by the Germans and became a war propaganda correspondent, working for the SS formation Scorpion of the East. A member of the press corps of Nazi and armed forces writers, Hey Holoko was later reported to have been placed in command of the Steel Cohort, apparently a group of Ukrainian nationalist propagandists attached to the Nazi army. Strickel states that towards the end of the war, Hey Holoko received a further promotion in the SS. In February 1945, Holoko was appointed editor of the newspaper Do Boyu to combat and attached to the SS Halychnia Division. Strickel may also shed light on Hey Holoko's desperate flight from justice at war's end. In June 1945, Hey Holoko was arrested in Augsburg, Germany, on charges of war crimes while serving in the SS. On his way to prison, once they were out of town, he knocked out and strangled his American driver, jumped out of the car, and ran away, leaving behind his papers, among them his photos and diary. After a couple of years in Germany, Hey Holoko decided to get away from that part of Europe altogether. In 1948, he went to England as Mr. Boyslawski, where he lived and worked during that year. Later, he decided to emigrate to Canada, but was reportedly held up by authorities who wondered with good reason why his brother, who had settled in Edmonton, Alberta, happened to have a different family name. Stranded in England, Mr. Boyslawski, still undivorced from his 1942 marriage, arranged an engagement through correspondence to a woman in Montreal, whom he had never met, in order to be sponsored into Canada as her fiancé. Although using a false name, in violation of Canadian immigration laws, remaining silent about his SS past, and remarried with a family left behind in Lviv, Hey Holoko succeeded in entering Canada in 1949. After visiting his brother in Edmonton, he came to Winnipeg, married his correspondence bride, and settled down. Correspondence bride. Holding various jobs and political affiliations within the nationalist community, Hey Holoko has a number of books published and once worked with the Ukrainsy Holos, Ukrainian Voice. In 1953, he briefly became out of the closet under his own name of Hey Holoko to pose as an expert on the Famine genocide in 1932-33. Thus, he appeared in The Black Deeds of the Kremlin, Volume 1. In the 1980s revival of the Famine genocide campaign, Hey Holoko, former Nazi collaborator and SS man, reappeared on the Cold War scene, an eyewitness to Famine genocide. Interviewed by the Winnipeg Free Press in 1983, Hey Holoko repeated the by now standard nationalist horror stories and rhetoric. Headlined "Dead Dragged by Legs and Stacked in Trucks Like Mere Cordwood." The article was accompanied by a photo of Hey Holoko and the second Mrs. Holoko confidently posed with smug smiles beneath an arranged icon of Jesus. Hey Holoko captured considerable limelight in Manitoba during the 50th anniversary of the famine. At a nationalist organized commemoration march and rally in Winnipeg in October 1983, Hey Holoko appeared as a key speaker alongside Manitoba Premier Howard Powley and two representatives from a Jewish organization who appear to have had short memories. Addressing the rally, Hey Holoko stated, "I am a victim who survived the great, great famine which the Soviet Union imposed upon those who refused to give in to slavery." Oh my God. One wonders just how Hey Holoko was a survivor of anything other than his own appetite, if his own books are any indication. Although he claims that the Jews and communists had access to food while the Ukrainians starved, in the autobiographical Smertonio Dorohio, Along the Road of Death, Volume 2, Holoko describes a relatively prosperous life. In the dining room, the table was covered. There stood his wife and younger daughter. We all sat down at the table and tasted borscht. We conversed, and then his wife brought in the cutlets and mashed potatoes. On New Year's 1933, Holoko writes of party going with a new girlfriend for whom he had purchased 2 new dresses and then seeing a movie. Later, they attended a party at the House of Literature, where there was an abundance of food and drink. Throughout the period in question, this famine genocide victim seems to have enjoyed more than his share of drinking and dining. Perhaps he meant he was a survivor from the retribution of the Ukrainian people, which he would have faced had he not changed his name and fled after the war. Holoko did not fight against the Nazi slavery, which murdered millions of Ukrainians, for whom he now pretends to speak. On the contrary, he served the new order in a number of capacities. He continues to serve as an exponent of the famine genocide campaign. That's it. That's it. Appendix. Appendix removed. You've you've had a successful appendix removal. Good morning. Wake up.